Chapter 1. The Weight of Expectations. Harry Potter had never particularly wanted to be special, which made the whispers following him through the corridors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry all the more unbearable. They slithered behind him like serpents, hissing speculation about his ability to speak to snakes, about his connection to Slytherin's heir, about whether the boy who lived might actually be the one terrorizing Muggle-born students. He kept his head down as he walked, pretending not to hear the way conversations died when he approached, pretending not to notice how his fellow Gryffindors had begun to look at him with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. The worst part wasn't the suspicion itself. Harry had grown accustomed to being stared at, whispered about, treated as something other than human. The worst part was how the whispers made him question himself. When he closed his eyes at night, he could still hear that voice, that cold, hungry voice that no one else seemed able to detect. Blood. I smell blood. It had hissed through the walls themselves, and Harry had felt something answering in his chest, something that recognized the language of serpents as naturally as breathing. He was special, all right. Special in ways that made him wonder if the Sorting Hat had been right to consider placing him in Slytherin House. Potter. Harry looked up from his barely touched breakfast to find Draco Malfoy standing beside the Gryffindor table, his pale hair gleaming in the morning light streaming through the great hall's enchanted ceiling. The Slytherin boy wore his usual expression of aristocratic disdain, but there was something sharper in his grey eyes today, something that made Harry's stomach clench with unease. Malfoy, Harry replied carefully, aware that conversations between them rarely ended well for anyone involved. Fascinating how the attacks only started after you arrived back at school, Draco said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables, almost like someone was waiting for the right moment to begin. Hunting. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Harry felt Ron tense beside him, heard Hermione's sharp intake of breath from across the table. Around them, the great hall had grown quieter, students leaning forward to catch every word of the exchange. "I didn't," Harry started, but Draco cut him off with a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "Of course you didn't," Draco said smoothly. After all, what would the boy who lived know about dark magic, about the kind of power that runs in certain bloodlines? His grey eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Though I suppose even you must have noticed how responsive you are to the voice of the air, how naturally the language of serpents comes to your tongue." Harry's hands clenched into fists on the wooden table. "I'm not—" "What you are," Draco interrupted, "is exactly what Salazar Slytherin intended. A wizard who understands that some blood is worth more than others, that some students deserve what's coming to them." His gaze swept dismissively over Hermione, whose face had gone pale at the obvious threat. "The only question is whether you'll admit it before or after the next mudblood is found petrified in a corridor." The slur hit the table like a physical blow. Ron shot to his feet, wand already in his hand, but Harry was faster. He rose from his seat with careful deliberation, meeting Draco's eyes with a steady gaze that had sent grown Death Eaters fleeing in terror. "Get away from my friends," Harry said quietly, "before I show you exactly what kind of wizard I am." For a moment, something like genuine fear flickered across Draco's pale features. Then he recovered his composure, straightening his Slytherin tie with affected casualness. "Your friends?" he repeated with emphasis on the word, as if it were something distasteful. "How wonderfully noble of you, Potter. I'm sure they appreciate your protection." His smile turned sharp. "Though I wonder how long that will last when they realize what you really are." He turned and walked back toward the Slytherin table with unhurried steps, leaving Harry standing among his fellow Gryffindors with his heart pounding and his hand still clenched into fists. The great hall remained unnaturally quiet for several long seconds, before conversations gradually resumed, though Harry could feel eyes on him from every direction. "Don't listen to him," Hermione said fiercely, but there was uncertainty in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. He's just trying to cause trouble. Course he is, Ron agreed, though he kept glancing at Harry with an expression that wasn't entirely comfortable. Kit's been looking for ways to get at you since first year. Harry nodded and sat back down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Draco's words had found their mark, not because they were cruel, but because they contained just enough truth to hurt. He could speak to snakes. He could hear voices that others couldn't. And somewhere in the deepest part of himself, in places he didn't like to examine too closely, there were moments when the heir's message didn't sound entirely wrong. Some people, after all, did deserve what was coming to them. Across the Great Hall, Pansy Parkinson had watched the entire exchange with the sort of rapt attention she usually reserved for particularly vicious gossip or expensive jewelry. She sat at the Slytherin table, surrounded by her usual coterie of followers, Millicent Bulstrode, Daphne Greengrass, and Tracy Davis, but her dark eyes had been fixed on Potter throughout Draco's little performance, cataloguing every micro-expression that crossed the Gryffindor's face. "Brilliant," she murmured to her tablemates, not bothering to lower her voice. "Absolutely brilliant. Did you see how Potter's face went all tight around the eyes? Draco hit something there." "Think it's true, then?" Tracy asked, leaning closer with the eager anticipation of someone hoping for scandal. "About Potter being the heir?" Pansy considered the question with the same careful attention she gave to everything else that might affect her standing in Slytherin House. Being right about important matters was crucial to maintaining her position among her peers, and being wrong could be socially devastating. She had learned early that in the complex hierarchy of pure-blood society, reputation was everything, and mistakes were remembered far longer than successes. "I think," she said slowly, "that Potter is exactly what he's always been, a half-blood with delusions of grandeur who thinks his famous scar makes him better than everyone else. But that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous." She smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. "After all, you know who was a half-blood too, wasn't he? And look how that turned out." The comparison drew appreciative murmurs from her companions, and Pansy felt the familiar warm glow of social approval. It was a feeling she had been chasing since her first day at Hogwarts, when she had realized that her family name alone wouldn't be enough to secure her place among Slytherin's elite. The Parkinsons were old blood, certainly, and wealthy enough to command respect, but they weren't inner circle. They weren't Malfoy or Black or Lestrange. They were the sort of family that had to work for their status, that had to prove their worth through careful maneuvering and strategic alliances, which was exactly what Pansy intended to do. "The real question," she continued, warming to her theme, "is what we do with this information. If Potter really is the heir, then we need to be careful not to cross him. And if he isn't—" She shrugged elegantly. "Well, then he's just another Gryffindor who thinks he's more important than he actually is. Either way, it might be useful to keep a closer eye on him." "You want to spy on Potter?" Millicent asked, sounding skeptical. "Bit risky, isn't it?" "Everything worthwhile is risky," Pansy replied, which was something her mother had told her repeatedly throughout her childhood. Lydia Parkinson had built her own reputation through calculated risks and strategic friendships, and she expected her daughter to do the same. Besides, knowledge is power, and in times like these, we need all the power we can get. She didn't mention that her interest in Potter went beyond mere strategic considerations. There was something about the way he had stood up to Draco just now, something in the deadly quiet of his voice when he had told Draco to get away from his friends. It reminded her of her father when he was truly angry, when the polite mask of pure-blood civility slipped enough to reveal the steel underneath. Potter might be a half-blood Gryffindor, but he carried himself like someone who understood power, like someone who had learned early that sometimes violence was the only language people truly understood. It was attractive in a way that made Pansy deeply uncomfortable with herself. "Speaking of times like these," Daphne said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "My father says the ministry is starting to panic. 2 attacks in a month, and they still have no idea who's behind it or how to stop it." "Good," Pansy said, with more venom than she had intended. "Maybe now they'll take proper security measures. Maybe now they'll start asking the right questions about who belongs at this school and who doesn't." Her companions nodded in agreement, but Pansy caught Tracy shooting a worried glance toward the Ravenclaw table, where several Muggle-born students sat huddled together in obvious fear. For just a moment, Pansy felt an uncomfortable twinge of something that might have been guilt or sympathy or simple human empathy. Then she pushed the feeling away with practiced ease. Emotions like that were a luxury she couldn't afford, not if she wanted to maintain her standing in Slytherin House, not if she wanted to live up to her family's expectations. The Parkinsons had survived the First War by being clever enough to avoid taking sides publicly while supporting the winning ideology privately. They had donated to the right causes, attended the right parties, married their children to the right families. They had done what was necessary to protect their interests. And Pansy had been raised to understand that survival sometimes required difficult choices. If a few Muggle-borns had to suffer for the greater good of wizarding society, well, that was simply the price of progress. "The real tragedy," she said aloud, "is that it's taken this long for someone to do something about the problem. Hogwarts has been admitting too many of the wrong sort for years. Maybe this heir, whoever they are, is finally going to set things right." The words felt strange in her mouth, harder to say than they should have been. But her companions nodded approvingly, and Pansy felt the familiar satisfaction of having said exactly what her audience wanted to hear. It was a skill she had cultivated since childhood, the ability to read a room and deliver the precise combination of words that would enhance her reputation and secure her position. She was very good at it. Sometimes she wondered if she was too good at it, if she had become so practiced at telling people what they wanted to hear that she had lost track of what she actually believed. But thoughts like that were dangerous, the kind of self-examination that led to weakness and doubt. Pansy Parkinson could not afford to be weak. Not when her family's expectations weighed so heavily on her shoulders. Not when her father's letters grew sharper with each passing week, reminding her that the Parkinson name meant something, and that she had better not disgrace it through foolish sentimentality or misplaced sympathy. Not when her mother's subtle hints about suitable marriage arrangements grew less subtle with each conversation, making it clear that Pansy's future depended entirely on her ability to maintain her status among Slytherin's most influential families. She was 15 years old, and already her life had been mapped out for her by people who cared more about blood purity and social connections than they did about her happiness or her dreams. The knowledge should have made her angry, should have made her want to rebel against the constraints that bound her so tightly she could barely breathe. Instead, it just made her more determined to excel within those constraints. If she was going to be judged by her ability to uphold pure blood values and secure advantageous alliances, then she would be the best at it. She would be so perfectly, flawlessly what her family expected that no one could ever question her worth or her loyalty, even if it meant saying things she wasn't sure she believed, even if it meant watching other students suffer in silence, even if it meant becoming someone she wasn't entirely sure she liked. The Morning Post arrived with a flutter of wings and a chaos of hooting, breaking Pansy from her increasingly dark thoughts. She watched as owls swooped through the great hall, delivering letters and packages to their recipients with varying degrees of grace. Her own family owl, a magnificent eagle owl named Perseus, landed beside her plate with military precision and extended his leg with dignity befitting a bird of his breeding. Pansy untied the letter with steady hands, though her heart sank a little when she recognized her mother's elegant script on the parchment. Lydia Parkinson's letters were rarely pleasant, focused as they were on Pansy's performance at school, her social connections, and her potential marriage prospects. But this letter felt different somehow, heavier with implication than usual. My dear Pansy, I trust this letter finds you in good health and excellent standing among your peers. Your father and I have been most concerned by the recent events at Hogwarts, and I felt it necessary to write to you directly about the proper response to such circumstances. As I'm sure you understand, times of crisis reveal the true character of both individuals and families. It is therefore essential that you comport yourself in a manner that reflects well on the Parkinson name and demonstrates your understanding of proper wizarding values. Your associations, your public statements, and your private conduct are all being observed by those who matter, and any misstep on your part will be remembered long after this current unpleasantness has been resolved. I have been in correspondence with several other families whose children attend Hogwarts, and I am pleased to report that your reputation remains largely intact. However, I have heard troubling rumors about increasing familiarity between students of different backgrounds. I trust I need not remind you that such associations can be deeply damaging to one's future prospects, regardless of whatever temporary social advantages they might seem to offer. Your father wishes me to convey his expectation that you will distinguish yourself during these difficult times by demonstrating the sort of clear thinking and moral clarity that has always characterized our family. The ability to recognize and associate with the right sort of people is not merely a social skill, my dear. It is a survival skill. I am confident that you will not disappoint us in this regard. With fondest affection and highest expectations, your mother Pansy read the letter twice before folding it carefully and tucking it into her robes. Her mother's meaning was clear enough. The attacks on Muggle-born students represented an opportunity for Pansy to demonstrate her commitment to pure blood ideology, and any sign of sympathy for the victims or criticism of the attacks would be viewed as disloyalty to her family's values. It should have been reassuring to receive such clear guidance about how she was expected to behave. Instead, it made her feel slightly sick. "Everything all right?" Daphne asked, noticing Pansy's expression. "Fine," Pansy replied automatically. "Just the usual parental guidance about maintaining proper standards." She pasted on her brightest smile and turned back to her breakfast, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Around her, her friends were discussing the latest Witch Weekly fashion trends with animated enthusiasm, their voices bright with excitement about dress robes and jewelry and all the things that had once seemed important to Pansy as well. Now, with her mother's letter burning like coal in her pocket and the knowledge that her every word and action was being judged by invisible observers, their chatter felt hollow. Everything felt hollow, actually. The conversations, the friendships, the carefully maintained facade of superiority that had once made her feel powerful and important. But hollow or not, it was the only life she knew how to live. And until someone offered her a better alternative, she would keep living it with all the grace and conviction she could muster. The day continued with its usual rhythm of classes and gossip, though an undercurrent of tension ran beneath even the most mundane interactions. Students walked in groups, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Teachers watched their classes with unusual intensity, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Even the portraits seemed more subdued than usual, their painted eyes following students with worried expressions. Harry felt the weight of that attention more keenly than most. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall's lips grew tight whenever she looked at him. In Charms, Professor Flitwick seemed to be studying him for signs of something. Even in Herbology, which was usually his most peaceful class, Professor Sprout watched him with the sort of careful consideration one might give to a plant that showed signs of disease. The worst part was Defense Against the Dark Arts, where Professor Lockhart held forth about his various adventures while completely ignoring the actual defense against dark arts that his students desperately needed to learn. Harry sat in the back of the classroom, trying to focus on Lockhart's increasingly ridiculous stories about his encounters with various dark creatures, but his mind kept wandering to that voice he had heard in the walls. Kill. Time to kill. It had been 3 days since the last time he had heard it, 3 days since Mrs. Norris had been found petrified in a corridor, and Harry found himself straining to detect any hint of that cold, hungry whisper. Part of him hoped he would never hear it again. Another part, a part he didn't like to acknowledge, was almost disappointed by the silence. Now, as I was saying, Lockhart continued, his perfect teeth gleaming in a practiced smile, when the Bandon Banshee realized that she was facing Gilderoy Lockhart, why, she simply gave up her haunting altogether. Sometimes, you see, reputation alone is enough to deter even the most persistent dark creature. Harry caught Hermione rolling her eyes and felt a moment of genuine affection for his friend. At least she still looked at him with exasperation rather than fear. At least she still acted like he was the same person he had always been, even if everyone else seemed to think he had transformed into some sort of monster overnight. "Mr. Potter," Lockhart said suddenly, and Harry realized that the professor had been speaking to him while his mind wandered. "Perhaps you would care to share your thoughts on the best method for dealing with a hostile dark creature." Harry blinked, trying to remember what they had been discussing. What? "The Bandon Banshee," Lockhart prompted, with the sort of encouraging smile teachers used on particularly slow students. "How would you handle such a creature if you encountered it in a dark corridor late at night?" Several students turned to look at Harry, and he felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never met a banshee." "Ah, but surely your unique experiences have taught you something about confronting dark creatures." Lockhart's smile grew wider, more theatrical. "After all, you did defeat you-know-who as a baby. Surely that gives you some insight into the proper mindset for facing such challenges." The classroom had gone completely silent. Harry felt the familiar surge of frustration and anger that always came when people reduced his entire identity to something that had happened when he was too young to remember it. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't special. He was just a 12-year-old boy who happened to have survived something that he didn't understand and couldn't remember. "I was a baby," he said quietly. "I didn't defeat anyone. I just survived." "Modesty," Lockhart declared with obvious delight. "How refreshing in someone so young and accomplished. But surely you must have some natural instinct for recognizing and confronting dark magic. Some inner sense that alerts you to danger." Harry thought about the voice in the walls, about the way it made his skin crawl and his heart race with something that wasn't entirely fear. He thought about the way snake language felt natural on his tongue, the way he could hear things that others couldn't. "No," he lied. "Nothing like that." But even as he said the words, he could feel the weight of skeptical stares from his classmates. They didn't believe him any more than he believed himself. And why should they? He had lied to them before, had hidden things from them that they had every right to know. He was hiding things from them even now. Maybe Draco Malfoy was right. Maybe Harry Potter was exactly the sort of person who would terrorize innocent students and then lie about it to their faces. The thought made him feel sick with self-loathing, but he couldn't entirely shake it. After all, what did he really know about himself? What did he really know about the darkness that seemed to follow him wherever he went? Class ended with Harry no closer to answers than he had been at the beginning. Students filed out of the classroom in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the day's gossip and speculation. Harry gathered his books slowly, hoping to avoid the corridor crowds until the rush died down. "Harry." He looked up to find Hermione standing beside his desk, her expression serious and worried. Ron hovered behind her, looking uncomfortable but determined. "We need to talk," Hermione said quietly. "About what Malfoy said this morning. About the voice you've been hearing." Harry's stomach clenched. "What about it?" "You never told us you could hear it," Ron said, and there was hurt in his voice alongside the worry. "You let us think you were just as confused as everyone else." "I am confused," Harry protested. "I don't understand what it means or why I can hear it or..." "But you can hear it," Hermione interrupted. "You can hear something that no one else can hear, something connected to the attacks. Don't you think that's important information? Don't you think we deserve to know?" Harry looked at his two best friends and saw the doubt in their eyes, the growing distance that his secrets had created between them. He wanted to tell them everything, wanted to explain about the voice and the way it made him feel, and the horrible suspicion that maybe he wasn't as different from Slytherin's heir as he wanted to believe. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to have that kind of power? How could he admit that part of him understood the appeal of being feared rather than pitied, of being seen as dangerous rather than just famous? "I'm sorry," he said instead. "I should have told you. I didn't want you to think." "Think what?" Ron asked. "That you're the heir of Slytherin? That you're going around petrifying people?" The questions hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harry met his friend's eyes and saw his own fears reflected back at him. They were thinking exactly what he was afraid they were thinking. They were wondering exactly what he was afraid they were wondering. And the worst part was that he couldn't honestly tell them they were wrong. "I'm not," he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'm not the heir. I'm not hurting anyone." Hermione studied his face with the intensity she usually reserved for particularly complex transfiguration problems. "We believe you," she said at last, though there was a careful quality to her voice that suggested the belief was more an act of will than genuine conviction. "Course we do," Ron agreed, but he didn't quite meet Harry's eyes when he said it. They walked back to Gryffindor Tower together, but the easy camaraderie that had once characterized their friendship felt strained now, weighted down by unspoken doubts and carefully avoided questions. Harry found himself wondering if this was how it would be from now on, his friends standing by him out of loyalty rather than trust, believing in his innocence because they had to, rather than because they wanted to. The thought was almost unbearable. That evening, as students made their way back to their dormitories after dinner, the castle felt different somehow. The shadows seemed deeper, the corridors more maze-like, the very stones of Hogwarts charged with anticipation. Harry walked with Ron and Hermione toward Gryffindor Tower, trying to participate in their conversation about homework and Quidditch, but his attention kept drifting to the sounds around them. Footsteps echoing off stone walls, whispered conversations between worried students, the distant howl of wind through ancient windows. They were halfway to the 7th floor when they heard the screaming. It came from somewhere below them, a sound of pure terror that cut through the evening quiet like a knife. Students in the corridor froze, looking at each other with wide eyes and pale faces. Then, as if released from a spell, everyone began moving at once, some running toward the sound, others fleeing in the opposite direction. Harry found himself running toward the screaming without conscious decision, Ron and Hermione beside him, their footsteps pounding on the stone floor as they raced down flights of stairs and through twisting corridors. Other students joined them as they ran, a growing crowd of Hogwarts pupils, all converging on the source of that terrible sound. They found the crowd gathered in a corridor on the 2nd floor, students pressed against the walls as teachers pushed through to reach whatever lay at the center of the disturbance. Harry caught a glimpse of Professor McGonagall's tartan robes, heard Professor Flitwick's squeaky voice, raised in what sounded like a protective charm. "Stand back!" Professor McGonagall was saying sharply. "Everyone stand back immediately!" But Harry was already pushing forward, driven by the same instinct that had made him run toward the screaming in the first place. He squeezed between older students, ignoring their protests, until he could see over the crowd to the corridor floor beyond. Mrs. Norris lay there, completely still, her yellow eyes wide and staring at nothing. But it wasn't the cat that made Harry's blood run cold. It was the message written on the wall above her in what looked like blood, the letters dripping and dark against the ancient stone. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir, beware." Harry stared at the words, his heart pounding so hard he could hear nothing else. This was it, then. The thing that the voice had been promising. The thing that had been building in the shadows of Hogwarts for weeks. Someone had finally acted on those whispered threats, had finally made good on the promise of blood and death that had been haunting the castle's corridors. And somewhere in the crowd of frightened students, someone else was staring at the message, with very different feelings. Someone who should have felt satisfaction at this proof that the air was real, that the cleansing of Hogwarts had finally begun. Instead, Pansy Parkinson felt only a cold knot of fear in her stomach, and the terrible suspicion that she might have gotten exactly what she wished for. The chamber was open. The air had made their first move, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. When Darkness Falls. 3 nights after Mrs. Norris was found petrified, Pansy Parkinson lay awake in her 4-poster bed, listening to the soft breathing of her dorm-mates, and fighting the urge to scream with frustration. Sleep had become elusive since the first attack, not because she feared for her own safety. She was a pure blood, after all, and therefore theoretically protected from the heir's wrath, but because the weight of expectations had grown so heavy she could barely breathe beneath it. Her mother's latest letter, which had arrived that morning with Perseus, and a particularly disapproving expression, had made the family's position crystal clear. The Parkinsons expected their daughter to distinguish herself during this crisis, to demonstrate the sort of moral clarity and political acumen that would secure her position among Slytherin's future elite. But beyond the vague directive to associate with the right sort and distance herself from undesirable elements, her parents had offered frustratingly little guidance about what exactly she was supposed to do. How did one distinguish oneself during a reign of terror? How did one demonstrate moral clarity when the very nature of the threat remained shrouded in mystery? And most importantly, how did one secure one's social position when the established order seemed to be crumbling around them with each passing day? Pansy turned over in her bed for what felt like the 100th time, staring at the green-tinged darkness that filtered through the Slytherin dormitory windows, the lake pressed against the glass like a living thing, its depths hiding secrets that she found herself thinking about far too often lately. There was something soothing about the way the water moved in slow, hypnotic patterns, something that reminded her that there were vast spaces in the world where social expectations and family obligations held no power whatsoever. The thought was dangerous, the kind of romantic nonsense that her mother would have dismissed with a sharp laugh and a lecture about the importance of practical considerations. But lying there in the darkness, surrounded by girls who had been chosen as her friends more for their family connections than their personal qualities, Pansy found herself wondering what it would be like to simply disappear beneath those dark waters, to sink down into the quiet depths where no one could expect anything of her, where she wouldn't have to perform the careful dance of pure blood propriety that had defined her entire existence. She sat up abruptly, pushing the morbid thoughts away with practiced determination. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her entire future depended on her ability to navigate the current crisis successfully. If she wanted to secure her position, if she wanted to prove to her parents and her peers that she was worthy of the Parkinson name, she needed to do something concrete, something that would demonstrate her understanding of the situation and her commitment to the right side of history. The older Slytherins had been talking in hushed whispers about the need for direct action ever since Mrs. Norris was found. Seventh years, like Marcus Flint and Adrian Pusey, spoke in code about investigations and security measures, their voices carrying the sort of authority that came from being close to graduation and therefore closer to real power in the wizarding world. They hadn't exactly invited the younger students to participate in their discussions, but they hadn't forbidden it either. There was an understanding that those who proved themselves capable of contributing to the cause might be welcomed into the inner circle, might be deemed worthy of respect and future opportunities. All Pansy had to do was prove herself worthy. She slipped out of bed with the sort of careful stealth that came from years of sneaking around Parkinson Manor after bedtime, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. Her doormates continued to sleep peacefully, their breathing deep and undisturbed by the weight of ambition that drove Pansy from her warm bed into the uncertain darkness of the castle corridors. Getting out of the Slytherin common room without triggering any alarms required more skill than she had anticipated. The password-protected door was easy enough. She simply had to wait for a late-returning student to provide the current phrase. But avoiding the prefects and the occasional professor required genuine stealth and more than a little luck. Pansy found herself creeping through shadows like a common criminal, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror that she hadn't experienced since her first forbidden exploration of Parkinson Manor's restricted library as a child. The castle felt different at night, older somehow, more aware of the generations of students who had walked its corridors before her. The portraits dozed in their frames, occasionally muttering in their sleep about things that had happened decades or centuries earlier. Suits of armor stood guard with patient vigilance, their empty helms somehow managing to convey disapproval of her nighttime wanderings. Even the ghosts seemed more substantial in the darkness, their pale forms drifting through walls and doorways with the sort of purposeful movement that suggested they had important business to attend to in the realm of the dead. Pansy made her way through the castle with no clear destination in mind, following corridors that seemed to call to her with whispered promises of secrets and discoveries. She was looking for something, some sign of the heir's presence, some clue that would allow her to contribute meaningfully to the older students' investigations. But she wasn't entirely sure what that something might look like. A hidden message, perhaps, or evidence of dark magic that the teachers had missed in their own searches. Something that would prove her worth and secure her future in ways that sitting quietly in the common room never could. She found herself drawn to the upper floors where the castle grew narrow and maze-like, where corridors branched and twisted in patterns that seemed designed to confuse unwary travelers. This was territory that most students avoided even during daylight hours, where the very architecture seemed hostile to human presence. But it was also where secrets would most likely hide, where someone seeking to avoid detection might conduct their dark business without fear of interruption. The corridor she finally chose was on the 7th floor, a narrow passage that connected the main castle to one of the towers. It was the sort of place that appeared on no official map, the sort of architectural afterthought that existed more by accident than design. The walls were older here, constructed of rougher stone that spoke of medieval builders who had valued function over beauty. The torches burned with a peculiar blue flame that cast dancing shadows in every direction, creating an atmosphere of barely contained, supernatural energy. Pansy walked slowly down the corridor, running her fingers along the ancient stones and searching for anything that might indicate the heir's presence. Hidden doors, perhaps, or concealed passages that led to chambers where dark magic might be practiced without detection. Her mother had told her stories about the old days, when pure-blood families had maintained private sanctuaries within their homes for the practice of magic that was considered too dangerous or controversial for public consumption. Perhaps Hogwarts contained similar spaces, forgotten rooms where Salazar Slytherin himself had once worked his will upon the world. The sound, when it came, was unlike anything she had ever heard before. It started as a whisper, so soft she almost convinced herself she had imagined it, then grew into a hiss that seemed to emerge from the very stones themselves. It was a language, she realized with growing excitement, though not one she recognized from her studies. The syllables were harsh and sibilant, formed by a throat that was clearly not human, speaking words that carried undertones of hunger and ancient malice. This was it. This was what she had been looking for. Pansy pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering with triumph and terror in equal measure. The heir was here, somewhere in this corridor, conducting whatever dark business had led to Mrs. Norris's petrification. All she had to do was remain hidden and observe, gathering intelligence that would prove her worth to the older students and secure her position among Slytherin's elite. The hissing grew louder, closer, accompanied by a sound like scales against stone that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Whatever was making those sounds was moving toward her, following the corridor with the sort of purposeful determination that suggested it knew exactly where it was going and what it intended to do when it arrived. Pansy looked around frantically for a hiding place, somewhere she could conceal herself while still maintaining visual contact with whatever was approaching. The corridor offered frustratingly few options. No alcoves or doorways, no convenient suits of armor or tapestries that might provide cover. There was only the narrow passage and the dancing blue flames of the torches, casting shadows that shifted and writhed like living things. She pressed herself into the deepest shadow she could find, holding her breath and praying to whatever gods might be listening that she would remain undetected. This close to discovery, this close to the sort of information that would change everything, she couldn't afford to be caught. Her entire future depended on her ability to observe without being observed, to witness the heir's activities without becoming their next victim. The sound grew closer still, until she could hear the whisper of movement just around the corner from where she stood hidden. The hissing continued, harsh and alien, speaking words that seemed to carry physical weight in the air around them. And beneath it all, a new sound began to emerge, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to emanate from something massive, something that moved with the slow, deadly grace of a predator that had never known fear. Pansy closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing, tried to become as small and insignificant as possible in her shadowy hiding place. She could feel her heart beating so hard she was certain it would give her away, could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air of the upper castle. This was what she had wanted, what she had sought out in her desperate quest for relevance and recognition. But now that the moment had arrived, she found herself wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The creature, for creature it clearly was, nothing human could make sounds like that, rounded the corner with fluid grace, and Pansy got her first glimpse of Salazar Slytherin's monster. It was impossibly large, easily 60 feet from its triangular head to the tip of its powerful tail. Its body was thick as a tree trunk, covered in scales that gleamed like emeralds in the torchlight, moving with the sort of sinuous power that spoke of muscles like steel cables beneath that armored hide. But it was the eyes that froze Pansy in place, eyes like molten gold that burned with an intelligence far older and more malevolent than anything that should exist in the natural world. The basilisk, the king of serpents, the creature that could kill with a glance and petrify with indirect sight, moving through Hogwarts like death itself, given physical form. Pansy tried to look away, tried to close her eyes or turn her head or do anything that might save her from the lethal gaze that was sweeping the corridor with predatory intent. But terror had frozen her muscles, left her standing in her inadequate shadow like a mouse hypnotized by the approach of a snake. She could only stare as the great head turned toward her hiding place, could only watch as those burning golden eyes fixed upon her with something that might have been amusement. The basilisk spoke again, its voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were in that same harsh language she had heard before, but somehow she understood their meaning with perfect clarity, as if the creature's intent was being transmitted directly into her mind. "What have we here? A little spy, watching from the shadows. How convenient." Pansy tried to scream, tried to run, tried to do anything that might save her from the fate that was rushing toward her with inexorable certainty, but her body refused to obey her commands, refused to move or speak or even breathe properly. She was trapped in her own skin, a prisoner of her own terror, able only to wait for death to claim her with those terrible golden eyes. The basilisk moved closer, its massive form filling the narrow corridor, its scales scraping against stone with sounds like fingernails on slate. It was toying with her, she realized with growing horror. It could have killed her instantly with direct eye contact, could have ended her life before she even knew she was in danger. Instead, it was choosing to prolong the encounter, to savor her fear before delivering the final blow. "You seek knowledge of the air's work," the creature hissed, its forked tongue tasting the air inches from her face. "You wish to understand the cleansing that has begun. Very well, little spy. Let me show you what awaits all who stand in the way of Salazar Slytherin's vision." The great head drew back slightly, preparing to deliver the killing gaze, and Pansy felt something break loose inside her chest. Not courage, she had no courage left, but a desperate, animalistic need to survive that transcended rational thought or social expectations. She threw herself sideways, away from the creature's hypnotic stare, and managed a single, terror-filled scream before her legs gave out entirely, and she collapsed to the cold stone floor. The scream echoed through the corridor like a battle cry, bouncing off ancient walls and racing through the castle's twisting passages with the speed of sound itself. And somewhere else in Hogwarts, someone heard that cry and understood its meaning with the sort of instinctive recognition that transcended conscious thought. Harry Potter had been lying awake in his four-poster bed, staring at the red curtains that surrounded him and trying not to think about the voice that had been whispering through the castle walls for the past 3 nights. Sleep had become impossible since Mrs. Norris was found petrified. Not because he feared for his own safety, but because he couldn't shake the terrible suspicion that he was connected to the attacks in ways he didn't understand and couldn't control. The voice had been getting stronger, more insistent, speaking words in that harsh language that felt like his native tongue, even though he had never learned it from any human teacher. Blood, it whispered through the stones themselves. Fresh blood to spill, young blood to taste. And Harry found himself understanding every word with a clarity that terrified him more than any external threat possibly could. He was the heir. He had to be. Nothing else explained his ability to hear the creature's voice, his instinctive understanding of its alien language. Nothing else explained the way his skin crawled with something that wasn't entirely revulsion when he listened to its promises of violence and death. He was Salazar Slytherin's heir, and somewhere in the darkest parts of his soul, the monster's bloodlust called to something that recognized it as kin. The realization should have sent him running to Dumbledore, should have driven him to confess his terrible nature and beg for help before anyone else was hurt. Instead, it filled him with a paralyzing mixture of self-loathing and fascination that kept him trapped in his bed, unable to sleep, but equally unable to take any action that might prevent further attacks. What if he was wrong? What if he wasn't the heir, but simply someone cursed with the ability to understand the creature's voice? What if his confession led to his expulsion or imprisonment, while the real culprit continued their reign of terror? What if he was right, but his dark nature ran so deep that any attempt at intervention would only make things worse? The questions circled through his mind like vultures, feeding on his fear and uncertainty, until he felt like he might go mad from the weight of them. And beneath it all, that voice continued to whisper through the walls, growing stronger and more demanding with each passing hour. "Hunt," it hissed. Time to hunt again. Harry shot upright in his bed, his heart pounding with sudden urgency. The voice was different tonight, more focused, more immediate. It wasn't the general malevolence he had been hearing for days. It was the sound of a predator that had found its prey. Someone was in danger. Someone was about to become the creature's next victim, and Harry was the only person in the castle who could hear the warning signs. He threw back his curtains and climbed out of bed, not bothering with slippers or a dressing gown. His doormates slept on undisturbed, their breathing deep and peaceful, oblivious to the crisis that was unfolding somewhere in the castle's depths. Ron muttered something about Quidditch strategies in his sleep, his red hair sticking up at odd angles. Seamus snored softly, one arm thrown over his eyes to block out the faint light that filtered through the tower windows. They looked so young, so innocent, so blissfully unaware of the darkness that prowled the corridors beyond their dormitory walls. Harry envied them their ignorance, even as he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was the one who could hear the voice, the one who understood the creature's language, the one who might be able to prevent another attack if he acted quickly enough, even if it meant revealing his own terrible nature in the process. Harry made his way through the common room and out through the portrait hole, ignoring the fat lady's sleepy protests about proper hours and appropriate attire. The corridors beyond were shrouded in darkness, lit only by torches that cast dancing shadows in every direction. The castle felt larger at night, more maze-like, as if the very architecture was conspiring to confuse unwary travelers and lead them astray. But Harry didn't need to navigate by sight. The voice was calling to him, growing stronger with each step he took toward its source. It pulled at something deep in his chest, some connection that transcended physical senses and spoke directly to the part of him that understood serpent language as naturally as breathing. He followed that pull through twisting corridors and up narrow staircases, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. The scream, when it came, nearly stopped his heart with its pure, undiluted terror. It was the sound of someone facing death itself, someone who had looked into the face of ultimate horror and found themselves wanting. It echoed through the corridors like a physical blow, sharp and desperate, and utterly, completely hopeless. Harry began to run. He raced through the castle with desperate urgency, following the echo of that scream and the growing intensity of the voice that whispered through the stones. His lungs burned with the effort. His legs protested the sudden demand for speed, but he pushed himself harder than he had ever pushed before. Someone was dying while he ran. Someone was facing the creature that haunted his dreams and spoke in his native tongue. He couldn't let that happen. Whatever his own nature, whatever darkness lived in his soul, he couldn't let an innocent person die while he had the power to prevent it. The corridor he finally reached was narrow and unfamiliar, one of the castle's forgotten passages that existed more by accident than design. The torches burned with blue flame here, casting strange shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. And at the far end of the passage, coiled like a nightmare made flesh, was the source of the voice that had been haunting his dreams. The basilisk was enormous, easily the largest living thing Harry had ever seen, its body thick as a tree trunk and covered in scales that gleamed like emeralds in the torchlight. Its triangular head swayed back and forth with hypnotic grace, golden eyes burning with malevolent intelligence as it studied something on the corridor floor. It was beautiful in the way that natural disasters were beautiful, terrible and magnificent, and utterly beyond human comprehension. And lying motionless at its base, her dark hair spread across the stone like spilled ink, was Pansy Parkinson. Harry's first instinct was to run, to flee from the creature that represented everything he feared about himself and the darkness that lived in his blood. His second instinct was to call for help, to alert the teachers and let someone with actual training and experience handle the crisis. But there wasn't time for either response. Pansy lay utterly still, her face pale as marble in the blue torchlight, and Harry could see the slight rise and fall of her chest that meant she was still alive. Still alive, but for how much longer? The basilisk sensed his presence and turned its great head toward him, its golden eyes seeking his with predatory intent. Harry looked away instinctively, focusing on the creature's reflection in a nearby suit of armor, instead of meeting that lethal gaze directly. Through the distorted metal surface, he could see the serpent studying him with something that might have been amusement. Another little spy, it hissed in that harsh language that Harry understood as clearly as English. Come to watch the cleansing, perhaps. Come to see what awaits all who stand against the heir's vision? Let her go, Harry said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. He was speaking English, but somehow he knew the creature would understand him regardless. "She hasn't done anything to you." The basilisk's laughter was like scales scraping against stone, harsh and utterly without warmth. "She has done everything, young speaker. She has lived when she shouldn't live, breathed when she shouldn't breathe, existed when her very presence defiles the sacred halls of Salazar Slytherin. Her blood is wrong, her heritage a mockery of everything this school was meant to represent." "Her blood?" Harry stared at Pansy's motionless form, confused. "She's pure blood. She's Slytherin. She's exactly the kind of person you're supposed to protect. Pure blood, yes, but not pure in purpose, not pure in intent. She seeks to use the heir's work for her own advancement, to twist the cleansing into something that serves her petty ambitions rather than the greater cause. She is corruption disguised as righteousness, poison wrapped in the proper forms. She must be removed before her influence spreads." Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what the creature was telling him. Pansy hadn't been targeted because she was Muggle-born, or because she opposed the heir's agenda. She had been targeted because she supported it for the wrong reasons, because her motivations were considered insufficiently pure by whatever intelligence was controlling the attacks. If the heir was willing to kill their own supporters for ideological impurity, then no one in the castle was truly safe. The violence wouldn't stop with Muggle-born students. It would continue until only those who met the heir's impossible standards remained alive. "You're wrong," Harry said firmly, keeping his eyes fixed on the reflection in the armor rather than looking directly at the creature. "She's just a kid. She's trying to figure out who she's supposed to be, just like everyone else. That doesn't make her evil." "Evil?" The basilisk's amusement grew sharper, more dangerous. "There is no evil here, young speaker. Only necessity. Only the natural order asserting itself against the chaos that has infected this sacred space. She will die because she must die, because her continued existence serves no purpose in the world that is to come." The great head began to turn back toward Pansy, preparing to deliver the killing gaze, and Harry felt something break loose in his chest. Not courage, he was terrified beyond rational thought, but a desperate, furious need to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. Without conscious decision, he threw himself forward, placing his own body between Pansy and the creature that meant to kill her. "No," he said, and his voice carried more authority than he had ever possessed before. "I won't let you hurt her." The basilisk paused, its golden eyes fixed on Harry's reflection with something that might have been surprise. "You would risk yourself for her? A Slytherin who despises everything you represent? A pure blood who considers you barely worthy of acknowledgement?" "Yes," Harry said without hesitation, "because she doesn't deserve to die for being confused and scared and trying to fit in. Because she's 15 years old, and she hasn't even had a chance to figure out who she really wants to be yet. Because protecting people is what I do, whether they like me or not." For a long moment, the corridor was utterly silent, except for the whisper of flames in their brackets. The basilisk studied Harry through the reflection with those terrible golden eyes, and Harry had the distinct impression that he was being judged by something far older and more dangerous than any human authority he had ever faced. "Interesting," the creature finally hissed. "You speak with the voice of serpents, yet you act with the heart of a lion. You understand our language, yet you oppose our purpose. What are you, young speaker? What manner of creature defends those it should rightfully rule?" "I'm Harry Potter," he replied, as if that explained everything, "and I'm asking you to let her live." The basilisk's laughter echoed through the corridor like breaking glass. "Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who defeated the Dark Lord through accident of birth and circumstance. Yes, I know who you are, young speaker. The question is whether you know what you are." Before Harry could ask what the creature meant by that, he heard the sound of wings beating against ancient air, the cry of a bird whose voice carried notes of fire and rebirth and indomitable will. Fawkes burst into the corridor like a comet made of flame and feathers, his song filling the narrow space with music that seemed to drive back the shadows themselves. The phoenix circled once around Harry's head, his golden feathers blazing with their own inner light, then dove directly at the basilisk's eyes with the fierce courage that had made him Dumbledore's companion for so many centuries. The great serpent reared back with a hiss of pain and fury as razor-sharp talons found their mark, drawing blood from that triangular head for what was probably the first time in the creature's long existence. "Phoenix!" the basilisk snarled, its voice filled with genuine rage for the first time since Harry had arrived. "The old man's bird. I should have expected his interference." Fawkes wheeled and struck again, his claws seeking the creature's eyes with mechanical precision. The basilisk writhed and twisted, trying to catch the agile bird in its coils, but Fawkes was too quick and too experienced in aerial combat to be trapped so easily. Blood flowed from wounds around the serpent's eyes, and Harry realized with growing hope that the phoenix was deliberately targeting the creature's most dangerous weapon. A blind basilisk couldn't kill with its gaze. A wounded basilisk might be driven away, at least temporarily. "This is not over, young speaker," the creature hissed as Fawkes continued his relentless attack. "The cleansing will continue, the weak will be removed, and you will discover what you truly are before this is finished." The basilisk withdrew with fluid grace, flowing back through the corridor like liquid shadow, its massive form disappearing into whatever hidden passages it used to move through the castle undetected. Fawkes gave one final triumphant trill and settled on Harry's shoulder, his warm weight a comforting reminder that he was no longer alone in the darkness. Harry knelt beside Pansy's motionless form, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. She was alive, unconscious, but alive, and that was all that mattered at the moment. Whatever else happened, whatever consequences this night brought, he had saved someone who needed saving. It was only as he gathered Pansy into his arms, preparing to carry her to the hospital wing, that he realized the full implications of what had just happened. He had spoken to the basilisk in its own language, had understood every word of their conversation with perfect clarity. He had commanded Fawkes through nothing more than desperate need, had somehow called Dumbledore's phoenix to his aid without any conscious knowledge of how such a thing might be accomplished. Most importantly, he had chosen to protect someone who represented everything he had been taught to mistrust. A Slytherin pure-blood who had never shown him anything but contempt, someone whose family values were diametrically opposed to everything he believed in. And he had made that choice without hesitation, without calculation, without any thought of personal gain or strategic advantage. Maybe that was what separated him from the heir, whatever his own dark nature might be. Maybe the ability to speak to serpents didn't determine who he was. Maybe his choices did. Pansy stirred in his arms as he made his way through the castle corridors, her dark eyes fluttering open to meet his with confusion and dawning recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken questions and reluctant gratitude. "Potter," she whispered finally, her voice hoarse from screaming. What happened?" "You nearly died," Harry replied honestly. "The basilisk found you in that corridor. If Fawkes hadn't shown up when he did—" He let the sentence trail off, but Pansy understood the implication well enough. Her face went pale, then flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger or simple shock. "You saved me," she said, and there was something like wonder in her voice. "You risked your life to save mine." Harry looked down at her, this girl who had spent 2 years treating him like something unpleasant she had stepped in, and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. She was just a person, he realized, confused and frightened and trying to live up to impossible expectations, just like him. The difference was that she had been taught to hide her fears behind cruelty, while he had been taught to hide his behind heroism. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Yeah, he said simply. I did. Pansy stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception or ulterior motive. When she found none, something in her expression softened, became almost vulnerable. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do that for me? I've been horrible to you. I've said terrible things about your friends. I've supported everything you're supposed to hate. Harry considered the question as he carried her through the castle corridors, past sleeping portraits and dozing ghosts, toward the safety of the hospital wing. Why had he saved her? Not because he expected gratitude or reward, not because he thought it would change anything between them. He had saved her because saving people was what he did, because he couldn't stand by and watch someone die regardless of how they had treated him in the past. Because you didn't deserve to die, he said finally. Because you're 15 years old and you deserve a chance to figure out who you want to be. Because protecting people is the right thing to do, even when those people don't like you very much. Pansy was quiet for the rest of the journey, but Harry could feel her watching him with something that might have been the beginning of respect, or at least the beginning of understanding. Madame Pomfrey took one look at Pansy's pale, shaken condition and immediately whisked her away to a private bed, muttering about exposure to dark creatures and the need for specialized monitoring. She confirmed what Harry already knew, that Pansy had suffered indirect exposure to a basilisk's gaze and was lucky to be alive. Direct eye contact would have killed her instantly. Even the indirect exposure she had experienced could have been fatal, if not for her quick thinking in looking away at the crucial moment. She'll make a full recovery, the Mediwitch assured Harry, as she administered a series of potions designed to counteract the creature's petrifying effects. But she needs rest, and she needs to avoid any further exposure to whatever attacked her. Do you have any idea what she was doing, wandering the corridors so late at night? Harry glanced at Pansy, who was pretending to be asleep, but clearly listening to every word of their conversation. He could tell her the truth, that Pansy had been seeking evidence of the heir's activities, probably hoping to gain social standing by contributing to the older Slytherin's investigations. But that truth would only get her in trouble with the teachers and her own housemates alike. I don't know, he lied smoothly. I heard screaming and followed the sound, found her collapsed in a 7th-floor corridor. Madame Pomfrey nodded approvingly. Quick thinking on your part, Mr. Potter, if you hadn't arrived when you did. She let the implication hang in the air, but her meaning was clear enough. After the Mediwitch had finished her examinations and retreated to her office to file her reports, Harry found himself alone with Pansy in the quiet hospital wing. She had given up pretending to be asleep and was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You could have told her the truth, she said quietly, about why I was in that corridor, about what I was looking for. What would be the point? Harry replied. You've been through enough tonight without getting in trouble for being curious. Pansy studied his face in the dim light filtering through the hospital wing windows. You understand, don't you? Why I was there, what I was trying to prove. Harry thought about her mother's letter, about the weight of family expectations that he had glimpsed in her interactions with other Slytherins, about the desperate need for acceptance that drove so many of their choices at this age. Yeah, he said. I understand. I could have died tonight, Pansy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. If you hadn't come when you did, if you hadn't put yourself between me and that creature, I would have died trying to prove something to people who probably wouldn't even have cared. The admission seemed to cost her something, some piece of the careful facade she had built around herself. Harry could see the cracks in her armor now, the fear and uncertainty that she worked so hard to hide behind her pure blood superiority. But you didn't die, he pointed out. You're alive, and you have a chance to figure out what you actually want to prove, and to whom. Pansy was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands where they lay folded on the white hospital blanket. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "I owe you a life debt now, don't I?" Harry started, not having considered the magical implications of what had happened. Life debts were serious magic, ancient and binding, creating connections between people that could last for decades. If Pansy truly owed him such a debt— "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe. Does it matter?" "It might," Pansy said, and for the first time since he had known her, she sounded genuinely uncertain. Life debts. They change things. Between people. They create obligations and connections that can't be ignored or dismissed. Harry thought about the creature's words, about its claim that Pansy supported the heir's agenda for the wrong reasons, about its willingness to kill even its supposed allies for ideological impurity. He thought about the conversation they had just had, about her admission that she had been seeking approval from people who might not even care if she lived or died. "Maybe," he said carefully, "that's not necessarily a bad thing." Pansy met his eyes, and for a moment the careful distance she maintained between herself and the world dropped away entirely. She looked very young suddenly, very scared, very much like a 15-year-old girl who had just realized that everything she thought she knew about herself might be wrong. "Potter," she said quietly, "what you did tonight, what you risked for me, I won't forget it. Whatever else happens, whatever people say, I won't forget that you were willing to die to protect someone who hasn't earned it." "Everyone deserves protection," Harry replied, "even when they haven't earned it. Especially when they haven't earned it." The words hung in the air between them like a promise or a challenge, and Harry could see something shift in Pansy's expression. Not gratitude, exactly, and not affection, but something that might eventually grow into respect, or at least understanding. Outside the hospital wing windows, dawn was beginning to break over the forbidden forest, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Harry of phoenix feathers. A new day was beginning at Hogwarts, bringing with it new possibilities and new choices for everyone who walked its ancient corridors. Harry Potter and Pansy Parkinson would face those choices together now, bound by ancient magic and shared experience in ways neither of them fully understood yet. The life debt would see to that, weaving their fates together whether they wanted it or not. But as Harry watched the sunrise paint Pansy's face in warm light, as he saw the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack and shift, he found himself thinking that maybe fate had gotten something right for once. Maybe some connections were worth having, even when they came at the cost of everything you thought you knew about the world. Maybe especially then. Chapter 3. Uncomfortable Truths. Pansy Parkinson had always prided herself on understanding the world in clear, uncomplicated terms. Purebloods were superior to half-bloods, who were superior to Muggle-borns. Slytherins were more ambitious and intelligent than the other houses. The Parkinson family, while not among the most elite, held a respectable position in wizarding society that came with both privileges and responsibilities. These truths had formed the foundation of her identity for 15 years, as unshakable as the stones of Hogwarts itself. Now, lying in a hospital bed with the taste of terror still sharp on her tongue, she found herself questioning everything she had ever believed about the natural order of things. Harry Potter, half-blood, Gryffindor, enemy of everything her family stood for, had risked his life to save hers. Not because he expected reward or recognition, not because he was trying to prove some larger point about the nobility of his cause, but simply because he believed she deserved to live. The simplicity of his motivation was what made it so difficult to dismiss or rationalize away. There had been no calculation in his green eyes when he placed himself between her and the basilisk, no hesitation when he chose to protect someone who had spent 2 years treating him with contempt. He had saved her because saving people was what he did, because he was, apparently, exactly the sort of person who would die for his enemies if that was what protecting them required. The realization made her feel sick with something that might have been shame or gratitude or simple confusion. How was she supposed to process the fact that her entire worldview had been shattered by a single act of inexplicable kindness? How was she supposed to reconcile her family's teachings about blood purity and social hierarchy with the memory of Potter's steady voice telling the basilisk that she deserved a chance to figure out who she wanted to be? Madame Pumphrey had released her from the hospital wing that morning with strict instructions about rest and avoiding strenuous activity. But Pansy found herself unable to follow either directive. Rest was impossible when her mind kept circling back to those moments in the corridor, replaying every word of the conversation she had witnessed between Potter and the creature that had nearly killed her. And avoiding strenuous activity was equally impossible when every social interaction now felt like navigating a minefield of competing loyalties and expectations. The first test came at breakfast, when she took her usual seat at the Slytherin table and tried to pretend that nothing had changed. Her friends greeted her with the sort of concerned attention that felt genuine enough, asking about her health and expressing relief at her recovery. But underneath their worry, Pansy could detect the sharp curiosity that drove so much of Slytherin's social dynamics. They wanted to know what had happened to her, where she had been found, who had brought her to the hospital wing. "Potter found you?" Daphne asked, her voice carefully neutral in the way that meant she was fishing for information that might prove useful later. "How fortunate." "Yes," Pansy replied, stirring her porridge without any real interest in eating it. "Quite fortunate." She could feel the weight of their stares, could sense the questions they were all too polite to ask directly. What had she been doing in that corridor? Why had Potter been there at the same time? What exactly had attacked her? And why wasn't she willing to provide more details about her ordeal? The truth was too complicated to share, too dangerous to reveal. How could she explain that she had been seeking evidence of the heir's activities, hoping to gain social standing by contributing to the older students' investigations? How could she describe her encounter with the basilisk without admitting that she had heard it speak, that she had understood its claims about ideological purity, and the need to remove even supporters who held the right beliefs for the wrong reasons? Most importantly, how could she explain that Potter had spoken to the creature in its own language, had somehow commanded Dumbledore's Phoenix to aid in her rescue, had demonstrated abilities that suggested connections to powers she didn't begin to understand? "The important thing is that you're safe," Millicent said firmly, though there was something in her expression that suggested she found the entire situation suspicious. "Whatever happened, whatever creature attacked you, you survived. That's what matters." Pansy nodded and tried to look grateful for her friend's support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was performing a role that no longer fit properly. These girls had been her closest companions for 4 years, sharing secrets and gossip and dreams about their futures in wizarding society. Now she felt like she was watching them from a great distance, observing the casual cruelty of their conversations about Muggleborns and half-bloods, as if seeing it for the first time. Had they always been so quick to dismiss other students as inferior? Had she always participated in those dismissals with such enthusiasm? The memory of her own words from just a few days earlier, her casual agreement that some students deserved what was coming to them, made her stomach clench with something that felt uncomfortably like self-disgust. "Speaking of Potter," Tracy said with the sort of malicious glee that meant she had gossip to share, "did you see the way Granger was staring at him this morning?" Poor girl looked absolutely terrified, probably worried that her precious hero is finally showing his true colors. The comment hit Pansy like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected in its casual cruelty. She found herself thinking of Potter's face when he had knelt beside her unconscious form, of the genuine concern in his voice when he had asked if she was hurt. He had looked nothing like a monster then, nothing like someone who would terrorize innocent students for the crime of their heritage. "Maybe she has reason to be worried," she heard herself saying, and immediately regretted the words. They had emerged without conscious thought, driven by some impulse she didn't fully understand. Her friends turned to stare at her with expressions of surprise and growing interest. "What do you mean?" Daphne asked, leaning forward with the sort of predatory attention that meant she sensed the possibility of truly valuable gossip. Pansy felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what she had implied. The natural interpretation of her comment was that Potter might indeed be the heir of Slytherin, that his rescue of her had been some sort of calculated move rather than genuine heroism. It was exactly the sort of speculation that would enhance her reputation among her peers and align with their existing prejudices about Gryffindors and half-bloods. It was also, she now realized with uncomfortable clarity, completely wrong. "I mean," she said carefully, trying to find words that would satisfy her friends without betraying the truth of what she had witnessed. "That maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the possibility that Potter is more complicated than he appears. That maybe there's more to him than just the boy who lived persona." The explanation seemed to satisfy her companions, who nodded sagely, as if she had revealed some profound insight about Potter's character. But Pansy felt hollow as she spoke the words, knowing that she was allowing them to interpret her meaning in ways that served their existing beliefs, rather than challenging those beliefs directly. She was taking the coward's way out, protecting herself and her social position, rather than speaking the uncomfortable truth about Potter's genuine heroism. It was exactly the sort of calculated response her mother would have approved of, maintaining plausible deniability while allowing others to draw their own conclusions. It was also exactly the sort of moral compromise that made her feel slightly sick with self-loathing. The conversation moved on to other topics: gossip about professors, speculation about the upcoming Quidditch match, complaints about homework assignments. But Pansy found herself unable to participate with her usual enthusiasm. Everything felt hollow somehow, performed rather than genuine, as if she were watching her friends from behind glass rather than sitting among them as an equal participant. When breakfast ended and students began making their way to their first classes, Pansy lingered at the Slytherin table, reluctant to face the day ahead. The prospect of sitting through transfiguration and potions and charms while pretending that nothing had changed felt exhausting in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "Pansy." She looked up to find Draco Malfoy standing beside her, his grey eyes sharp with something that might have been concern or calculation or simple curiosity. He had been unusually quiet during breakfast, she realized, content to observe rather than dominate the conversation as he usually did. "Draco," she replied, wondering what he wanted and why he had chosen to approach her privately rather than speaking in front of the others. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't quite a request. Draco had a way of making suggestions sound like commands, a skill that served him well as the unofficial leader of their year's Slytherin students. "I think we need to talk." They made their way out of the Great Hall together, walking in silence through corridors that were beginning to fill with students heading to their morning classes. Draco led her to a secluded alcove near the entrance to the dungeons, a place where they could speak privately, without fear of being overheard by passing teachers or curious classmates. "Tell me what really happened," he said, without preamble, his pale eyes fixed on her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Not the story you told Pomfrey, not the version you gave our friends at breakfast. The truth." Pansy felt her heart skip a beat as she realized how much attention Draco had been paying to her carefully constructed explanations. She had underestimated his intelligence, his ability to read between the lines of what she wasn't saying. "I don't know what you mean," she said automatically, falling back on the sort of defensive neutrality that had served her well in difficult situations before. Draco's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course you don't. Just like you don't know why Potter happened to be wandering the corridors at the exact moment you needed rescuing. Just like you don't know what kind of creature attacks someone without leaving any visible wounds or obvious traces of dark magic." Each question hit closer to the truth than Pansy was comfortable with, and she could see in Draco's expression that he knew he was hitting his mark. He was fishing for information, trying to piece together a puzzle that he suspected was far more interesting than the simple story she had provided. Potter was probably just out after hours for his own reasons, she said, trying to sound dismissive rather than defensive. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he was meeting someone. How should I know what Gryffindors do with their spare time? How indeed, Draco replied, but there was skepticism in his voice that suggested he wasn't buying her explanation. Though it is interesting, isn't it? Potter just happening to be in the right place at the right time to play hero. Potter managing to fight off whatever attacked you when even seventh years have been struggling to identify the threat. Potter, who can apparently speak to snakes and hear voices that no one else can detect. The last comment sent ice through Pansy's veins as she realized how close Draco was getting to the truth. If he suspected that Potter could communicate with the basilisk, if he had connected the dots between Potter's Parseltongue abilities and his presence at the scene of her attack. "What are you implying?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "I'm not implying anything," Draco said smoothly. "I'm stating facts. Potter has abilities that connect him to the attacks. Potter was present at the scene of your incident. Potter somehow managed to fight off a creature that has been terrorizing the entire school." His grey eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "The question is whether he's the heir himself, or whether he's been working with the heir all along." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Pansy felt something twist in her chest that might have been anger or fear or simple revulsion. The idea that Potter might be responsible for the attacks, that his rescue of her had been some sort of elaborate deception, was so fundamentally wrong that she couldn't find words to express her disgust. But how could she defend him without revealing what she had actually witnessed? How could she explain that Potter had risked his life to protect her from the real heir without admitting that she had been seeking evidence of the heir's activities? How could she describe the genuine courage she had seen in his green eyes without betraying the trust he had shown by keeping her own motivations secret? "That's ridiculous," she said finally, though the words felt inadequate to express the depth of her certainty. "Potter isn't the heir. He's not working with the heir. He's just—" "Just what?" Draco prompted, and there was something hungry in his expression that made Pansy realize how dangerous this conversation was becoming. Whatever she said next would be remembered and repeated, analyzed for any information that might prove useful to Draco's ongoing campaign against Potter. "He's just Potter," she finished lamely, knowing that the explanation was insufficient, but unable to offer anything more substantial without revealing too much. Draco studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're protecting him," he said finally, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "Pansy Parkinson, defender of pure blood values and Slytherin tradition, is protecting Harry Potter." The words made her flinch, as if he had struck her, not because they were untrue, but because they were so obviously accurate. She was protecting Potter, defending him against accusations that she knew to be false based on what she had witnessed firsthand. The realization should have horrified her, should have sent her running back to the familiar comfort of her family's ideology and her house's prejudices. Instead, it made her feel something that might have been pride. "I'm not protecting anyone," she said, but even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. "I'm just saying that wild accusations without evidence aren't particularly useful. If you want to prove that Potter is connected to the attacks, you need more than speculation and coincidence." Draco's smile grew wider, more satisfied, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Oh, Pansy," he said softly, "you have no idea what you're getting yourself into, do you?" Before she could ask what he meant by that, he was walking away, leaving her standing alone in the alcove with her heart pounding and her hands shaking with something that might have been anger or fear or simple confusion. She had the distinct feeling that she had just crossed a line, made a choice that would have consequences she couldn't yet anticipate. She was right. By lunchtime, word had spread through Slytherin House that Pansy Parkinson had defended Harry Potter in a private conversation with Draco Malfoy. The story grew in the telling, as stories always did, until various versions claimed that she had declared Potter innocent of all charges, that she had romantic feelings for the boy who lived, that she had been secretly meeting with him for weeks before her mysterious accident. None of the rumors were accurate, but accuracy had never been particularly important to Slytherin gossip networks. What mattered was the implication, the suggestion that one of their own had developed sympathies that were inappropriate for someone of her background and breeding. Pansy felt the weight of their stares as she made her way through the corridors between classes, heard the whispered conversations that died abruptly when she approached. Her dorm-mates had grown distant, speaking to her with the sort of careful politeness that meant they no longer considered her a trusted member of their inner circle. Even professors seemed to be watching her more closely, as if wondering whether her loyalty to Slytherin House had been compromised by her association with Potter. The isolation was more painful than she had expected, cutting deeper than the physical fear she had experienced during her encounter with the basilisk. These people had been her community for 4 years, her source of identity and belonging in the complex social ecosystem of Hogwarts. Now she found herself on the outside, looking in, marked as different in ways that made her former friends uncomfortable and suspicious. She tried to tell herself that it didn't matter, that their opinions were based on rumors and speculation rather than actual knowledge of what had happened. But the truth was that their suspicions weren't entirely wrong. She had defended Potter, was continuing to defend him even now in her thoughts and private conversations. Something fundamental had changed in her understanding of the world, and everyone around her could sense that change, even if they couldn't identify its precise nature. It was during defense against the dark arts that she got her first real test of how much things had changed. Professor Lockhart was holding forth about his various adventures, as usual, but today his stories seemed focused on conflicts between different types of wizards: pure-bloods versus half-bloods, light wizards versus dark, civilized society versus savage outsiders. The important thing to remember, Lockhart was saying with his trademark smile, is that some conflicts are simply unavoidable. When you have people of fundamentally different natures, different values, different breeding, well, sometimes accommodation is simply impossible. Sometimes one side must prevail over the other for the good of wizarding society as a whole. Several Slytherin students nodded approvingly at this wisdom, and Pansy felt a familiar sick twist in her stomach as she recognized the ideology that had shaped her upbringing. The idea that conflict between different types of people was natural and inevitable, that some groups were inherently superior to others, that violence in service of the right cause was not only acceptable but necessary. She had believed these things once, or at least she had believed that she believed them. Now they sounded hollow and cruel, the sort of rationalization that people use to justify behavior they knew was wrong. Of course, Lockhart continued, it's important to recognize when someone is pretending to be something they're not, when they claim to support the right values, but actually serve the wrong cause. These false allies can be more dangerous than open enemies, because they undermine the unity that good people need to prevail against evil. The comment was clearly directed at current events, at the ongoing investigation into the heir's identity and motivations. But Pansy heard something else in the professor's words, something that made her wonder if he was speaking more specifically about students who had been asking uncomfortable questions or expressing inappropriate sympathies. Students like her. "Professor," she found herself saying before she could think better of it, "what if someone's values change? What if they realize that what they thought was right actually isn't?" The classroom went dead silent. Lockhart's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with professional brightness, but Pansy could see the calculation behind his blue eyes as he considered how to respond to such an unexpected question. "Well," he said slowly. "I suppose that would depend on why their values changed, wouldn't it? If someone abandons their principles because of weakness or cowardice or undue influence, then such a change would hardly be commendable. But if they come to embrace higher principles, principles more aligned with the greater good—" He let the sentence trail off, but his meaning was clear enough. It wasn't the change itself that mattered, according to Lockhart's worldview. It was the direction of the change, whether it moved someone toward or away from the correct set of beliefs. And those correct beliefs were defined by whoever held power at any given moment. Pansy felt several pairs of eyes turning toward her, classmates who had recognized the personal nature of her question and were wondering what it revealed about her current state of mind. She could practically feel Draco's smug satisfaction from across the room, his certainty that she had just confirmed his suspicions about her loyalties. But she could also feel something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. From the Gryffindor side of the classroom, she could sense Potter watching her, with what might have been concern or curiosity, or simple recognition of a kindred spirit struggling with complicated questions about right and wrong. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Pansy saw something in his green gaze that she hadn't expected to find there. Not gratitude for her indirect defense of his character, not satisfaction at her growing distance from her Slytherin peers, but something that looked almost like understanding. He knew what it felt like to be caught between competing loyalties, she realized. He knew what it felt like to question the beliefs you had been raised with, to find yourself isolated from people who had once accepted you unconditionally. He knew what it felt like to be neither fully one thing nor another, suspended between worlds that both claimed you and rejected you in equal measure. The realization made her feel less alone somehow, less like she was navigating uncharted territory without any guidance or companionship. Potter might not be able to help her figure out what she believed or where she belonged, but at least she wasn't the only person in the world struggling with such questions. Class ended without any further disruption, but Pansy could feel the weight of speculation and suspicion following her through the corridors as students made their way to their next lessons. The whispered conversations were growing bolder now, less concerned with maintaining even the pretense of discretion. Her name was being connected to Potter's in ways that would have horrified her just a week earlier. Now she found herself wondering why such connections should be considered scandalous. What was so terrible about being associated with someone who risked his life to protect others? What was so shameful about questioning beliefs that led to violence against innocent people? The questions followed her through Transfiguration and potions, through lunch and study hall, through the endless social navigation that defined daily life at Hogwarts. By evening, she felt exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical activity and everything to do with the mental effort required to pretend that she was still the same person she had been a week earlier. She was making her way back to the Slytherin common room after dinner when she encountered Potter in a corridor near the dungeons. He was alone, walking with the sort of careful alertness that meant he was expecting trouble, and she realized that his isolation might be even more complete than her own. At least she still had a house to return to, even if her housemates regarded her with increasing suspicion. Potter was being shunned by students from all four houses, treated as a potential threat by people who had once considered him a hero. "Potter," she said quietly, not entirely sure why she was acknowledging him publicly when doing so would only fuel more rumors about her loyalties. He stopped and turned to face her, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Parkinson," he replied with equal neutrality. They stood there for a moment in the flickering torchlight, two students who had been thrust into an unlikely connection by circumstances beyond their control. Pansy found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the monster that so many people seemed convinced he was becoming. Instead, she saw exhaustion and worry and the sort of bone-deep sadness that came from being consistently misunderstood by people who should know better. "How are you feeling?" he asked finally, and she could tell that the question was genuine rather than merely polite. After what happened, I mean. Are you all right? The simple courtesy of the question hit her harder than she had expected. When was the last time someone had asked about her well-being without ulterior motives, without fishing for information or social advantage? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen a person rather than a potential ally or enemy or source of gossip? I'm fine, she said automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, no, I'm not fine. Everything feels different now. Complicated. Potter nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. It is complicated, he agreed. When things happen that change how you see the world, it takes time to figure out where you fit in the new version. There was something in his voice that suggested he was speaking from experience, that he had faced his own moments of having his worldview challenged and reshaped by unexpected events. Pansy found herself wondering what those moments had been, what had forced the boy who lived to question his own assumptions about good and evil and the nature of heroism. "Potter," she said impulsively, then stopped, not sure how to articulate what she was feeling. "Yeah? Thank you," she said simply. "For what you did, for not letting me die, for not telling anyone why I was in that corridor." She paused, gathering courage for the next part, and for not expecting anything in return. Potter studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his response carefully. "You don't need to thank me," he said finally. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Pansy replied with quiet certainty. "You didn't. Most people would have calculated the risks, would have worried about what saving me might cost them socially or politically. You didn't hesitate. You just acted because it was the right thing to do." She met his eyes directly. "That's not what anyone would have done. That's what you did." Something shifted in Potter's expression, some of the guardedness giving way to something that might have been surprise or gratitude or simple recognition. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying that. For—" he gestured vaguely at the space between them. "For this. Whatever this is." Pansy knew what he meant. This moment of honest communication between two people who were supposed to be enemies. This acknowledgement that the world was more complicated than either of their houses wanted to admit. This fragile beginning of something that might eventually become understanding, if not friendship. "Potter," she said, as he turned to continue down the corridor. "Yeah? If anyone asks why I was in that corridor, why you were there at the same time..." She took a breath, making a choice that she knew would have consequences. "Tell them we were meeting to discuss our potions essay. Tell them we've been study partners for weeks." Potter's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That would make things more complicated for you," he pointed out. People think a lot of things," Pansy interrupted. "Most of them are wrong, anyway. At least this way, if anyone questions the timing, we have an explanation that doesn't involve either of us admitting to breaking school rules." It was a practical solution to a potentially dangerous problem, but they both knew it was more than that. By offering to claim a connection to Potter, by volunteering to be publicly associated with him in a way that would protect them both, she was making a statement about where her loyalties lay. She was choosing him over them, over her house, over her family's expectations, over everything she had been taught about the natural order of wizarding society. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel something that might have been relief. "Okay," Potter said slowly. "If anyone asks, we're study partners." "Study partners," Pansy agreed, and the words felt like a promise, or a pact, or the beginning of something that neither of them fully understood yet. They parted ways then, Potter continuing toward Gryffindor Tower, while Pansy made her way to the dungeons. But as she walked through the familiar corridors toward her common room, she found herself thinking about the look in his eyes when she had offered to provide him with an alibi. Not gratitude exactly, and not surprise, but something that looked almost like hope. Maybe she wasn't the only person who was beginning to question the beliefs they had been raised with. Maybe she wasn't the only one who was discovering that the world was more complex than their childhood lessons had suggested. Maybe change was possible, even for people like them. The thought followed her into the Slytherin common room, where her housemates regarded her with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. They knew something was different about her, could sense the shift in her loyalties, even if they couldn't identify its precise nature. And tomorrow, when word inevitably spread about her conversation with Potter in the corridor, their suspicions would be confirmed. She was becoming someone different, someone who defended her enemies and questioned her friends, someone who chose individual conscience over group loyalty. It was a dangerous transformation in a place like Slytherin House, where conformity was valued above almost everything else. But as she settled into her bed that night, listening to the whispered conversations of her doormates and thinking about the look in Potter's eyes, Pansy found herself wondering if danger might be worth it, if it meant finally becoming someone she could respect. The life debt she owed him was more than just magical obligation, she realized. It was the beginning of a debt she owed to herself, the debt of becoming someone worthy of the life he had chosen to save. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, and it followed her into dreams filled with golden eyes and whispered promises, and the sound of her own voice speaking truths she hadn't known she believed. Change was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The only question was whether she would have the courage to meet it head-on. Outside her window, the lake pressed against the glass like a living thing, its dark depths hiding secrets that might never be revealed. But sometimes, if she looked carefully enough, she could see lights moving in those depths, small, fragile flames that persisted despite the crushing weight of water above them. Maybe that was what courage looked like. Not the absence of pressure, but the willingness to keep burning despite it. Maybe that was what she was learning to be. Chapter 4. Lines in the Sand. The explosion came during Charms class, 3 days after Pansy's corridor conversation with Harry Potter had been witnessed by half a dozen students and reported throughout the castle with the speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve. Professor Flitwick had been attempting to teach them the Protean charm, a piece of magic that seemed laughably irrelevant when students were being petrified by unknown creatures and the very foundations of Hogwarts' social order were shifting beneath their feet. Pansy sat in her usual seat near the middle of the classroom, trying to focus on the complex wand movements required for the spell, while ignoring the whispered conversations that surrounded her like a rising tide. Her name had been linked to Potter's in increasingly creative ways over the past few days, each iteration of the rumor mill adding new details about their supposed relationship and her alleged betrayal of pure blood values. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more dangerous than any of the rumors suggested. She and Potter were not secret lovers, were not plotting against their respective houses, were not engaged in any of the romantic or political conspiracies that seemed to fascinate their classmates so thoroughly. What they were doing was far simpler and far more subversive. They were beginning to see each other as human beings rather than representatives of competing ideologies. "Miss Parkinson," Professor Flitwick squeaked from his precarious perch atop a stack of books. "Perhaps you could demonstrate the charm for the class. You seem to have mastered the wand movement." Pansy looked down at her galleon, which had indeed been successfully charmed to display the number sequence that Flitwick had assigned. The magic had come easily to her, requiring none of the concentration that usually accompanied new spells. She wondered if her distracted state had somehow made the casting smoother, if her mind's preoccupation with more important matters had allowed her instincts to guide the magic without interference. "Of course, Professor," she replied, standing and demonstrating the precise wrist flick that activated the charm. The galleon in her hand shifted to display a new sequence, and several other coins around the classroom responded in sympathy, their surfaces rippling with the same numbers. "Excellent work," Flitwick praised, clapping his tiny hands together with genuine delight. 5 points to Slytherin for such masterful wand work. The praise should have made her feel proud, should have reinforced her connection to her house and her identity as a Slytherin student. Instead, it made her feel hollow, as if she were being congratulated for a performance rather than an achievement. The points meant nothing if they were awarded to someone who was rapidly becoming something other than what Slytherin House represented. "Show off," Draco muttered from his seat near the front of the classroom, his voice pitched just loud enough for several students to hear. "Though I suppose she's been practicing magic with her new study partner." The comment was delivered with the sort of calculated malice that Draco had perfected over 4 years of social warfare, designed to sound casual while delivering maximum damage. Several Slytherin students snickered appreciatively, recognizing the reference to her supposed relationship with Potter, and enjoying the opportunity to see one of their own brought down by her own poor choices. Pansy felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it wasn't the flush of embarrassment that Draco had been hoping to provoke. It was anger, pure and sharp, directed not just at Draco, but at the entire system of social control that he represented. The casual cruelty of his comment, the assumption that any association with Potter was inherently shameful, the way her housemates laughed as if her supposed downfall was entertainment rather than tragedy. "At least my study partner doesn't spend his time making wild accusations about fellow students," she heard herself saying, her voice carrying clearly through the classroom, despite her attempt to keep it low. "At least he bases his opinions on evidence rather than prejudice." The silence that followed her words was so complete that Pansy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Professor Flitwick had frozen mid-gesture, his tiny face showing confusion and growing alarm as he realized that his charms class had somehow become the venue for what appeared to be a significant political confrontation. Students from all 4 houses turned to stare at her, their expressions ranging from shock to excitement to horrified fascination. Draco's pale face had gone completely white, his grey eyes wide with something that might have been disbelief or fury or simple amazement that she had dared to challenge him so publicly. For a moment, Pansy thought he might actually hex her right there in the middle of class. Consequences be damned. "Miss Parkinson," Professor Flitwick squeaked nervously. "Perhaps we should focus on the lesson at hand." "No," Draco said softly, his voice carrying the sort of deadly quiet that preceded explosions. "I think Miss Parkinson has something she wants to say. About evidence and opinions, and the sort of study partners she prefers to associate with." He stood from his seat with fluid grace, turning to face her fully, and Pansy realized that this was it, the moment of no return that she had been approaching for days without fully understanding the consequences. Whatever she said next would define her position in the ongoing conflict, would determine whether she remained a Slytherin in anything but name or became something else entirely. "I'm saying," she replied with quiet conviction, "that accusing someone of being a murderer because they can speak to snakes is exactly the sort of ignorant prejudice that our house claims to be above. I'm saying that making assumptions about people based on their blood status or their house affiliation is the mark of a small mind, and I'm saying that anyone who actually bothered to look at the evidence would realize that Harry Potter is more likely to be the heir's next target than the heir himself." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and Pansy could see their impact ripple through the classroom in waves of shock and outrage and fascinated horror. She had not just defended Potter, she had used his given name, had spoken of him with obvious respect and familiarity, had openly challenged the core beliefs that united Slytherin House against the rest of the world. She had committed social suicide in the most public way possible. "How dare you?" Draco breathed, his voice shaking with genuine rage. "How dare you stand there and defend that half-blood freak, that pretender, that what?" Pansy interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. That boy who risked his life to save a Slytherin student he barely knew? That person who could have let me die without any personal cost but chose to help me anyway? That human being who sees people as individuals rather than as representatives of their blood status? She was aware that she was revealing more than she had intended, that her words were confirming rumors about her rescue that she and Potter had agreed to keep vague. But in the heat of the moment, with Draco's hatred blazing in his grey eyes and her housemates staring at her like she had transformed into something alien and dangerous, she found that she no longer cared about maintaining their careful fiction. Let them know the truth. Let them understand that Potter had saved her life without expectation of reward or recognition, that he had acted from pure moral conviction rather than calculated self-interest. Let them grapple with what that meant about their assumptions regarding Gryffindors and half-bloods and the nature of heroism itself. "You're sick," Draco said with quiet venom. "Stockholm Syndrome, my father calls it. When someone starts sympathizing with their captor, starts believing that their abuse is actually kindness." His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Potter didn't save you, Pansy. He put you in danger in the first place, then played hero to manipulate your gratitude. And you're too pathetic to see through such an obvious deception." The accusation hit her like a physical blow, not because she believed it, but because she recognized the twisted logic that made it sound plausible to people who wanted to believe the worst about Potter. It was exactly the sort of explanation that would allow her housemates to maintain their existing prejudices while dismissing her testimony about Potter's character. "That's not what happened," she said firmly, but she could see in Draco's expression that he had no interest in the truth. He wanted a version of events that confirmed his worldview, that allowed him to maintain his hatred without having to confront the possibility that he might be wrong about fundamental questions of good and evil. "Isn't it?" Draco's voice grew louder, more theatrical, playing to their audience of fascinated classmates. "Potter just happened to be in the right place at the right time to rescue you from a creature that no one else has been able to identify or track. He just happened to have the skills necessary to fight off something that has been terrorizing the entire school, and now you just happen to be defending him with the sort of passion usually reserved for family members or lovers." Each question was designed to sound more damning than the last, building a case for Potter's guilt that relied on coincidence and innuendo rather than actual evidence. But Pansy could see how effective Draco's argument was, could watch her classmates nodding along as he painted a picture of deception and manipulation that fit their existing beliefs perfectly. "You're wrong," she said, but the words felt inadequate to counter the weight of Draco's certainty and the crowd's desire to believe him. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Draco stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "I know that you've been meeting with Potter in secret. I know that you've been asking questions about changing loyalties and abandoning your principles. I know that you've been defending him against accusations that any true Slytherin would recognize as obviously correct." His grey eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "What I don't know is whether you're a traitor or just a fool." The word hit the classroom like a curse, sharp and ugly and impossible to take back. Traitor. The worst accusation that could be leveled against a member of Slytherin House, the charge that had destroyed careers and ruined families throughout wizarding history. Draco had not just questioned her judgment or criticized her choices, he had attacked her fundamental loyalty to everything their house represented. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Professor Flitwick clearing his throat with obvious desperation. "That will be quite enough," the tiny professor declared, his voice higher and more strained than usual. "This is a charms classroom, not a political debate forum. Miss Parkinson, Mr. Malfoy, please return to your seats and focus on the lesson." But the damage had been done. The word traitor hung in the air like smoke, poisoning every interaction and marking Pansy as something dangerous and other in the eyes of her housemates. She could see it in their faces, the way they looked at her now, not with curiosity or disapproval, but with the sort of wary hostility reserved for genuine enemies. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had chosen a side in a conflict that admitted no middle ground. And in making that choice, she had lost not just her standing in Slytherin House, but her identity as the person she had been for 15 years. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel something that might have been relief. Class ended with mechanical efficiency, students packing their bags and filing out with the sort of subdued energy that followed explosive confrontations. Pansy remained in her seat until the room had mostly emptied, reluctant to face the corridors full of gossip and speculation that awaited her beyond the classroom door. "Miss Parkinson," Professor Flitwick said softly, approaching her desk with obvious concern. "Are you quite all right, my dear?" She looked up at the tiny professor, this kind man who had always treated his students with equal respect, regardless of their house affiliations, and felt something twist in her chest that might have been gratitude or grief or simple exhaustion. "I'm fine, Professor," she lied. "Just thinking about the charm work." Flitwick's expression suggested that he didn't believe her explanation for a moment, but he nodded with the sort of professional discretion that made him such an effective teacher. "The Protean charm can be quite demanding," he agreed diplomatically. "If you need any additional assistance with the technique, please don't hesitate to ask." It was a kind offer, and Pansy found herself wondering if he was speaking about more than just charm work. Professor Flitwick had been at Hogwarts long enough to see many students struggle with conflicts between personal conscience and social expectation, had probably watched other young people navigate the treacherous waters of changing loyalties and shifting identities. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than he would ever know. "I'll remember that." She made her way out of the classroom and into corridors that felt hostile in ways they never had before. Students stepped aside as she passed, some out of respect for her obvious distress, but most out of the sort of wariness reserved for dangerous or unpredictable people. Word of her confrontation with Draco had spread with the speed of wildfire, growing and changing in the telling until she could hardly recognize her own actions in the whispered accounts that followed her through the castle. By the time she reached the Great Hall for lunch, the story had transformed into a dramatic declaration of love for Potter, complete with tearful confessions and passionate defenses of his innocence. Other versions cast her as a secret agent working to undermine Slytherin House from within, or as a victim of Potter's dark influence, or as a blood traitor who had been plotting against her own kind since the beginning of the year. None of the stories were accurate, but accuracy had never been particularly important when it came to Hogwarts gossip. What mattered was the narrative impact, the way each version reinforced existing beliefs about house loyalty and blood purity, and the dangers of inappropriate relationships. She took her usual seat at the Slytherin table, and immediately felt the weight of hostile stares from her housemates. The conversation around her died to uncomfortable silence, replaced by the sort of tense atmosphere that preceded either explosive confrontations or complete social ostracism. "Pansy," Daphne said carefully, her voice pitched to carry just enough false warmth to maintain the pretense of friendship while making her disapproval absolutely clear. "How are you feeling, dear? After your outburst in charms class?" The question was a trap, designed to give Pansy an opportunity to apologize for her behavior and recant her defense of Potter, while their housemates watched and judged her response. It was exactly the sort of social maneuvering that Pansy had once excelled at herself, the careful balance of offering face-saving exits while making the consequences of continued defiance absolutely clear. "I'm feeling fine," Pansy replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Though I'm curious about why defending someone against false accusations would be considered an outburst rather than simply speaking the truth." The response drew sharp intakes of breath from several directions, confirmation that she was continuing to dig herself deeper rather than attempting to climb out of the hole she had created. Millicent actually flinched, as if Pansy had struck her, while Tracy's face went pale with what might have been horror or fascination or simple disbelief. The truth? Millicent's voice was tight with anger and disappointment. The truth is that you've lost your mind over a half-blood Gryffindor who wouldn't have looked at you twice before you started making a fool of yourself defending him. The truth is that you've forgotten everything your family taught you about loyalty and propriety, and the importance of maintaining proper associations. Each word hit like a physical blow, not because Pansy believed the accusations, but because they came from someone who had been one of her closest friends for 4 years. Millicent wasn't speaking from malice or political calculation. She was speaking from genuine concern and growing bewilderment at changes she couldn't understand or accept. "My family," Pansy said quietly, "taught me that actions matter more than words, that protecting innocent people is more important than maintaining social appearances, that courage in defense of what's right is the highest virtue a person can possess." She met Millicent's eyes directly. "If those lessons have led me to defend someone who deserves defending, then I'm proud to follow them." The words were true, though she realized as she spoke them that her understanding of her family's teachings had changed dramatically over the past week. Her parents had indeed taught her about courage and virtue and moral responsibility, but they had intended those lessons to apply only within the boundaries of pure-blood society. They had never imagined that their daughter would use their own moral framework to defend someone they would consider inherently unworthy of such protection. "Your family," a cold voice said from behind her, "would be appalled to hear you speaking such nonsense." Pansy turned to find Marcus Flint standing beside their table, his heavy features set in an expression of disgust and disappointment. As a 7th year and Quidditch captain, Marcus held significant influence within Slytherin House, and his public disapproval carried weight that could make her social situation far worse than it already was. "Marcus," she replied with careful neutrality, wondering what had motivated him to involve himself in her conflicts. "How nice to see you." "Is it?" Marcus's smile was cold enough to freeze water. "I wonder if you'll still think so after you read this." He dropped a rolled parchment onto the table beside her plate, the thick paper and formal seal marking it as official correspondence rather than casual student mail. Pansy recognized the seal immediately, the Parkinson family crest, pressed into dark green wax and radiating the sort of authority that came with centuries of wizarding tradition. Her mother's latest letter. And from Marcus's expression, it was not going to contain the sort of gentle guidance that had characterized their previous correspondence. Pansy broke the seal with steady hands, though her heart was pounding with something that felt like dread mixed with anticipation. Whatever the letter contained, it would represent her family's official response to the rumors about her behavior, their judgment of her choices, and their expectations for her future conduct. She unrolled the parchment and began to read, aware that Marcus and several other students were watching her face for signs of the letter's contents. Her mother's elegant script covered the page in lines of perfectly formed words that carried the weight of family honor and social expectation. "My dear Pansy, I write to you today with a heavy heart and grave concerns about reports that have reached your father and me regarding your recent conduct at Hogwarts. While we had hoped that the previous guidance we provided would be sufficient to help you navigate these difficult times with appropriate discretion and wisdom, it appears that more direct intervention has become necessary. We have received detailed accounts of your public defense of Harry Potter, a half-blood student whose loyalties and motivations remain highly questionable despite his previous fame. More troubling still are reports that you have been meeting with this boy privately, developing what can only be described as an inappropriate association that reflects poorly on both your judgment and your understanding of proper social boundaries. I must tell you plainly, Pansy, that your behavior has become a source of considerable embarrassment to our family, The Parkinson name has been maintained for centuries through careful attention to reputation and strategic alliance building, and your recent actions threaten to undermine generations of careful work in pursuit of what can only be described as adolescent rebellion. Your father has been in correspondence with several other prominent families, and I regret to inform you that your marriageability has already suffered significant damage as a result of these associations. The Knott family has withdrawn their preliminary interest in a future betrothal, and the Zabinis have made it clear that they would not consider any alliance with a family whose daughter has demonstrated such poor judgment in her personal relationships. This is not merely a matter of social convenience, my dear daughter. Your future security, your children's prospects, your ability to maintain the lifestyle and status that you have enjoyed throughout your childhood, all of these depend on your ability to conduct yourself in a manner that reflects well on our family's reputation and values. Therefore, your father and I have decided that immediate corrective action is required. You will cease all association with Harry Potter immediately and completely. You will publicly apologize for your inappropriate comments in defense of his character. You will return to the social circles appropriate to your station and demonstrate through your actions that your loyalty to your family and your house remains intact. If you fail to comply with these directives within 1 week's time, we will have no choice but to consider more drastic measures. The Parkinson family cannot afford to be associated with someone who consistently demonstrates such poor judgment and disloyal behavior, regardless of our personal affections. I do not write these words lightly, Pansy. You are our daughter, and we love you deeply. But that love cannot extend to supporting choices that threaten everything our family has worked to build and maintain. The decision of how to proceed rests entirely with you, with sincere hopes for your swift return to appropriate conduct. Your mother Pansy read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it beside her untouched lunch. The words were devastating in their clinical precision, dismantling her future piece by piece with the sort of methodical efficiency that her mother had always brought to difficult conversations. Marriage prospects destroyed, family reputation damaged, financial security threatened, all because she had chosen to defend someone who had saved her life. The threat of disownment hung over the letter like a sword, unspoken but absolutely clear in its implications. Her parents were giving her 1 week to choose between Potter and everything she had ever known about her own identity and place in the world. Bad news? Marcus asked with false sympathy, his tone making it clear that he had already guessed the letter's general contents. Family troubles, perhaps. Pansy looked up at him, this boy who represented everything about Slytherin House that she was beginning to find repugnant. The casual cruelty, the assumption that other people's pain was entertainment, the belief that social position gave him the right to humiliate anyone he deemed inferior. A week ago, she would have considered him an ally, someone whose approval was worth seeking and whose disapproval was to be avoided. Now she saw him for what he was, a bully who enjoyed watching other people suffer, someone who used his position to inflict maximum damage on those who couldn't fight back effectively. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied with quiet dignity, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Just the usual parental concerns about academic performance and social development. It was a lie, and everyone at the table knew it was a lie. But it was also a choice, the decision to handle her family crisis privately, rather than giving her housemates the satisfaction of watching her break down publicly. Marcus's expression showed disappointment at being denied the spectacle he had clearly been hoping for. But he was too experienced in social warfare to press the issue directly. Instead, he leaned closer and lowered his voice to a whisper that somehow managed to carry more menace than any shout. "Careful, Parkinson," he murmured. "Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. Some choices, once made, define everything that comes after." His smile was sharp and cold. "I'd hate to see you make a decision you'll spend the rest of your life regretting." The threat was clear enough, though couched in language that would allow Marcus to claim he had simply been offering friendly advice if questioned by any teachers who might be listening. He was letting her know that her defiance had been noted by the older students, that her continued association with Potter would bring consequences that extended far beyond social disapproval. "Thank you for your concern," Pansy replied with icy politeness. "I'll be sure to give your advice the consideration it deserves." Marcus studied her face for a moment, searching for signs of fear or submission that would indicate his intimidation tactics were having their desired effect. When he found none, his expression hardened into something approaching genuine hostility. "See that you do," he said curtly, then turned and stalked away, leaving Pansy alone with her silent housemates and the weight of choices that would define the rest of her life. The remainder of lunch passed in uncomfortable silence, her former friends maintaining the sort of careful distance that meant they were no longer entirely sure which side she was on. By the time students began making their way to afternoon classes, Pansy felt exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with academic pressure and everything to do with the emotional labor of navigating a social minefield while maintaining some semblance of dignity. She was gathering her books when she felt someone sit down beside her on the bench. She looked up expecting to see one of her roommates, perhaps ready to offer private counsel about returning to appropriate behavior before it was too late. Instead, she found Harry Potter, his green eyes serious and concerned as he studied her face with obvious worry. "Rough morning?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to the students, still lingering at nearby tables. Pansy glanced around nervously, aware that Potter's presence at the Slytherin table was drawing stares and whispered comments from every direction. His decision to approach her publicly, in the heart of her own house's territory, was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Possibly both. "You could say that," she replied carefully, wondering what had motivated him to seek her out, when doing so would only fuel more rumors about their supposed relationship. "Though I'm not sure sitting with me is going to help either of our reputations." Potter shrugged with the sort of casual indifference that suggested he had stopped caring about his reputation some time ago. "My reputation has been pretty much destroyed since second year started," he pointed out. "Half the school thinks I'm the heir of Slytherin, and the other half thinks I'm too dangerous to be around. One more rumor isn't going to make much difference." There was something almost liberating in his complete lack of concern about what other people thought of him, Pansy realized. He had moved beyond the social calculations that consumed so much of her mental energy, beyond the careful balancing of relationships and reputations that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember. "Still," she said, "you don't have to make things worse for yourself by associating with me. People are already talking. Let them talk." Potter's voice carried quiet conviction that reminded her of the way he had spoken to the basilisk, the sort of moral certainty that came from knowing exactly where you stood on fundamental questions of right and wrong. "I wanted to thank you." Pansy blinked in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" "For what you said in charms class. For defending me when you didn't have to, when doing so was going to cost you." He met her eyes directly. "No one's ever done that for me before. Not like that. Not when it mattered." The simple gratitude in his voice hit her harder than she had expected, reminding her that Potter was just as isolated as she was becoming, just as cut off from the social networks that usually provided support and understanding during difficult times. The difference was that he had chosen his isolation by refusing to compromise his principles, while hers was being forced on her by circumstances beyond her control. "You saved my life," she replied. "Defending you against unfair accusations is the least I can do." "Is it?" Potter studied her face with the sort of intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through to thoughts she hadn't even acknowledged to herself. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're paying a pretty high price for your principles." He gestured subtly toward the letter that still lay beside her plate, the formal seal and expensive parchment marking it as the sort of correspondence that usually carried life-altering news. Pansy realized that he had probably witnessed at least part of her interaction with Marcus, had seen enough to understand that her family's response to her behavior was not going to be supportive. "Nothing I can't handle," she said, echoing her earlier response to Marcus's false sympathy. Potter's expression suggested that he didn't believe her deflection any more than her housemates had, but he was too polite to press the issue directly. Instead, he changed the subject with the sort of careful diplomacy that reminded her he had been dealing with unwanted attention and social pressure for most of his life. "I wanted to ask you something," he said quietly. "About what you said in class, about evidence and assumptions. You mentioned that anyone who looked at the actual facts would realize I'm more likely to be a target than the heir." Pansy felt her stomach clench as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Yes? What did you mean by that? What evidence were you thinking of?" It was a reasonable question, given that she had made such a definitive statement in front of their entire charms class. But answering it honestly would require her to admit how much thought she had given to his situation, how carefully she had analyzed the pattern of attacks and his reactions to them. It would require her to admit that she had been thinking about him far more than was appropriate for someone who was supposed to consider him an enemy. "I meant," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that the attacks have been targeting people who represent everything you claim to value. Muggle-borns, people who believe in equality and integration rather than separation and superiority. If you were really the heir, wouldn't you be going after different targets? People who actually threaten the pure blood agenda?" Potter nodded thoughtfully, and Pansy could see him working through the implications of her analysis. "You're right," he said after a moment. "The heir isn't just attacking random Muggle-borns. They're sending a message about who belongs at Hogwarts and who doesn't." "Exactly." Pansy felt a rush of satisfaction at his immediate understanding, at the way he grasped concepts that her own housemates seemed unable or unwilling to consider. "And that message is diametrically opposed to everything you've ever said or done. You've spent 2 years proving that you judge people by their character rather than their blood status." "Have I?" Potter's expression was troubled, and Pansy realized that he was genuinely uncertain about his own motivations and actions. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself about who I really am. Sometimes I think maybe I'm more like them than I want to admit." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable, that Pansy felt something twist in her chest that might have been sympathy or recognition or simple human connection. He was struggling with the same sort of self-doubt that had been plaguing her since their encounter in the corridor, the same questions about identity and authenticity that made sleep difficult and social interactions feel like performances. "You're not," she said with quiet certainty. "Trust me on this. Whatever darkness you think you see in yourself, it's nothing compared to the real thing." Potter studied her face with obvious curiosity. "You sound like you speak from experience." Pansy thought about her family's letter, about the casual cruelty of her housemates' conversations, about her own past participation in the sort of systematic dehumanization that made violence seem not just acceptable but necessary. "I do," she admitted, "more than I'd like to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had found themselves on the same side of a conflict they hadn't chosen, united by circumstances that neither of them fully understood. The great hall was emptying around them as students made their way to afternoon classes, but Pansy found herself reluctant to break the spell of honest communication that had settled between them. "Potter," she said finally. "Harry," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be allies in this, you might as well use my name." The casual offer of familiarity hit her harder than it should have, representing, as it did, a level of trust and acceptance that she hadn't experienced from anyone in days. Her own housemates were treating her like a potential enemy, her family was threatening disownment, and her former friends were backing away as if her new principles might be contagious. But Harry Potter was offering her something that felt like friendship. "Harry," she said, testing the name on her tongue and finding that it felt natural in ways she hadn't expected. "I was going to ask, would you like to study together sometime? Actually study, I mean. Not just maintain the pretense for appearances." Harry's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Study what?" "History of magic, for one thing. I've been thinking about what you said, about the air sending messages through their choice of targets. If we really want to understand what's happening, we need to understand the history behind it. The original Chamber of Secrets incident, Salazar Slytherin's actual beliefs and motivations, the political context that made his ideas appealing to some wizards and appalling to others." She was warming to the theme now, her academic instincts engaging with problems that had genuine importance rather than merely serving as exercises for theoretical advancement. "Professor Binns has been teaching the same sanitized version of events for decades, focusing on dates and names without any real analysis of the underlying ideological conflicts. But I bet the library has primary sources that would give us a much clearer picture of what actually happened." Harry's expression had shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like excitement, and Pansy realized that she had touched on something that genuinely interested him. "You think understanding the history would help us figure out who the current heir might be?" "I think," Pansy said carefully, "that understanding the history would help us figure out what the current heir is trying to accomplish. And once we understand their goals, their methods might start making more sense." It was a reasonable academic proposal, the sort of research project that any serious student might undertake when confronted with mysterious events that had clear historical precedents. But they both knew it was more than that. It was a commitment to working together, to pooling their knowledge and perspectives in service of finding truth rather than simply confirming existing prejudices. It was the beginning of something that might eventually become real friendship, if they were both brave enough to let it develop. "When?" Harry asked simply. "Tonight? After dinner? The library stays open until 10 on weeknights." Pansy felt her heart rate accelerate as she made the commitment, aware that she was taking another step away from her old life and toward something entirely unknown. "We could start with Hogwarts, a history, and work our way toward more specialized sources." "Sounds perfect." Harry's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since the attacks began, and Pansy realized that he was just as isolated and lonely as she was becoming. The prospect of having someone to share his burdens with, someone who understood the complexity of their situation, was probably as appealing to him as it was to her. They parted ways then, Harry heading toward Gryffindor Tower, while Pansy made her way to the Dungeons for Potions class. But as she walked through corridors that had grown increasingly hostile over the past few days, she found herself thinking about the look in his eyes when she had offered to research with him. Not gratitude, exactly, and not calculation, but something that looked almost like hope. As if he had been waiting for someone to offer genuine partnership rather than mere alliance. Someone who was willing to work toward understanding rather than simply choosing sides. Maybe that was what she was becoming. Someone who asked questions instead of accepting easy answers. Someone who valued truth more than social approval. Someone who was willing to stand with people who deserved standing with, regardless of the personal cost. The thought should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to the familiar comfort of her family's expectations and her house's prejudices. Instead, it made her feel something that might have been pride. She was becoming someone who could look Harry Potter in the eye without shame, someone who had earned the right to be considered worthy of his trust and friendship. And if that transformation cost her everything she had once believed about herself and her place in the world, well, maybe some things were worth losing if it meant finding something better to replace them. The library that evening felt different than it ever had before, transformed from a place of solitary study into something that might eventually become a sanctuary for people who asked dangerous questions and sought uncomfortable truths. As Pansy settled into a chair across from Harry and opened the first of many books that would help them understand the forces arrayed against them, she realized that she was no longer fighting just for her own principles or her own conscience. She was fighting for the right to choose who she wanted to be, regardless of what anyone else thought she should become. And for the first time in days, that felt like a battle she might actually have a chance of winning. Chapter 5. The Price of Loyalty. The owl arrived during breakfast on Thursday morning, a magnificent eagle owl that landed beside Pansy's untouched porridge with the sort of theatrical precision that suggested its message was as important as its impressive appearance implied. She recognized Perseus immediately, her family's ancient patriarch of the owlery, but there was something different about his bearing this morning. Where he usually radiated the dignified confidence appropriate to a bird of his noble breeding, today he seemed almost apologetic, as if he understood that the message he carried would bring nothing but pain to its recipient. Pansy untied the letter with hands that trembled only slightly, though she was aware that every eye at the Slytherin table was watching her reaction with the sort of predatory attention that had become all too familiar over the past week. Her housemates had learned to read her correspondence like weather patterns, analyzing each letter for signs of family approval or disapproval that might indicate whether her recent behavior had consequences beyond mere social ostracism. This particular letter felt different even before she unfolded it, heavier somehow, weighted with the sort of formal authority that came only with the most serious family communications. The parchment was thicker than usual, bearing the full Parkinson coat of arms rather than her mother's personal seal, and the handwriting was her father's rather than her mother's elegant script. Whatever news Perseus carried, it was significant enough to require the head of the family's direct intervention. Pansy, your mother and I have concluded that written correspondence is insufficient to address the gravity of your recent behavior and its implications for our family's reputation and future prospects. We will be visiting Hogwarts this Saturday to meet with you personally and with the relevant school authorities to discuss your academic progress and social development. This is not a request for your permission or availability. You will make yourself available in the entrance hall at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, appropriately dressed and prepared to discuss your recent choices with the seriousness they deserve. We have already arranged a meeting with Professor Snape to review your standing within Slytherin House, followed by a private family conference that will determine the terms of your continued enrollment at Hogwarts. I trust I need not explain the importance of demonstrating through your words and actions that you understand the severity of the situation you have created. Your continued position in this family depends entirely on your willingness to correct the errors in judgment that have brought us to this point. We sincerely hope that when we meet on Saturday, we will find that our daughter has returned to the principles and loyalties that we raised her to value above all else. Regulus Parkinson, head of the Parkinson family. Pansy read the letter 3 times before its full implications settled in her mind like lead weights in her stomach. Her parents weren't just threatening consequences for her behavior. They were coming to Hogwarts to deliver those consequences personally. The formal tone, the use of her father's official title, the careful language about her continued position in this family all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. They were preparing to disown her unless she recanted everything she had said and done in defense of Harry Potter. The realization should have sent her running to Dumbledore's office to beg for protection, or to Professor Snape to negotiate some sort of compromise that might appease her family's anger while allowing her to maintain some semblance of personal integrity. Instead, it made her feel something that might have been relief mixed with terror. At least now she knew exactly where she stood. At least now the consequences of her choices were clear and immediate, rather than hanging over her head like a sword that might fall at any moment. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her robes, aware that her housemates were still watching her face for signs of distress that might provide entertainment or social advantage. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down, would not provide them with another piece of gossip to spread through the castle like wildfire. "Bad news?" Daphne asked with false sympathy, her tone making it clear that she hoped for exactly the sort of family crisis that would force Pansy to abandon her inappropriate loyalties and return to proper Slytherin behavior. "Nothing I can't handle," Pansy replied, with what she hoped was convincing calm, though she could hear the strain in her own voice, despite her best efforts to sound unaffected. It was becoming her standard response to questions about her family's reaction to her behavior, a meaningless phrase that bought her time to think while revealing nothing about the mounting pressure she was under. But each repetition felt more hollow than the last, less convincing to her audience, and less believable to herself. The truth was that she didn't know if she could handle what was coming. Her parents were formidable opponents, even under the best of circumstances, armed with decades of experience in emotional manipulation and backed by the full weight of pure-blood social expectations. Fighting them while maintaining her principles and protecting her growing friendship with Harry would require strength and courage that she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. But the alternative, abandoning Harry when he needed allies most, returning to the comfortable cruelty of her old beliefs, accepting the role of dutiful daughter whose thoughts and feelings were considered irrelevant to family decisions, felt like a death of everything she was discovering about herself. She would rather face her parents' wrath than face herself in the mirror after such a betrayal. The thought followed her through the morning's classes, a constant undercurrent of anxiety that made it difficult to focus on transfiguration theory or potions ingredients. Her professors seemed to sense her distraction, but none of them pressed her for explanations that might prove embarrassing for all parties involved. Even Professor Snape, who usually took every opportunity to critique Slytherin students who brought negative attention to his house, limited himself to disapproving looks that spoke volumes about his awareness of her situation. By lunchtime, word had spread through the castle that the Parkinson parents were coming to Hogwarts for what everyone assumed would be a disciplinary intervention. The gossip mill had transformed the basic facts into increasingly dramatic versions, ranging from claims that Pansy was being forcibly withdrawn from school to speculation that she was being married off immediately to prevent further embarrassment to her family name. None of the rumors were entirely accurate, but they captured the general understanding that Pansy's rebellion was about to face its ultimate test. Students who had been content to watch her social fall from a safe distance now regarded her with the sort of morbid fascination usually reserved for public executions or natural disasters. She was making her way to defense against the dark arts when she overheard the conversation that finally pushed her past the breaking point of passive endurance. "About time someone put that blood traitor in her place," Marcus Flint was saying to a group of older Slytherins gathered near the staircase to the dungeons. His voice carried the sort of satisfied malice that suggested he was enjoying the prospect of her imminent downfall. "Girl's been getting too big for her britches, thinking she can cozy up to Potter without consequences." "Disgusting, really," agreed Adrian Pusey, his tone heavy with the sort of moral superiority that came from never having questioned the beliefs he had been taught as a child. Bad enough when she started defending him in public, but now she's practically throwing herself at him every chance she gets. No self-respect whatsoever. Pansy felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger as she realized how her library study sessions with Harry were being interpreted by her housemates. In their minds, her genuine interest in research and truth-seeking had been transformed into something sordid and shameful, evidence of romantic desperation rather than intellectual curiosity. "My father says the Parkinsons are mortified," added Cassius Warrington with obvious relish. "Apparently they're considering cutting her off entirely if she doesn't come to her senses. Can't say I blame them. I wouldn't want a daughter who goes around defending half-blood scum either." The casual cruelty of the comment hit Pansy like a physical blow, not because she hadn't heard similar sentiments before, but because it came from people who had once considered her worthy of basic respect and human decency. These boys had eaten at the same table as her for years, had included her in social gatherings and study groups, had treated her as a valued member of their extended social network. Now they were discussing her potential disownment with the sort of gleeful anticipation usually reserved for Quidditch matches or holiday celebrations. "She'll come crawling back," Marcus said, with confident dismissal. Girls like that always do, when they realize what they're giving up for a few moments of attention from someone famous. Give her parents a few hours to explain the facts of life, and she'll be apologizing for her behavior and begging for forgiveness. "And if she doesn't?" Cassius asked, with obvious hope for drama. Marcus's smile was cold enough to freeze water. "Then she'll learn what happens to blood traitors who forget where their loyalties should lie. Some lessons can only be taught the hard way." The threat was clear enough, though couched in language that would allow Marcus to claim he had simply been making general observations about social dynamics if questioned by any teachers who might be listening. He was letting anyone within hearing distance know that Pansy's continued defiance would bring consequences that extended far beyond family disapproval. Pansy pressed herself against the stone wall of the corridor, using a convenient tapestry to conceal her presence while she processed what she had just heard. These people, her housemates, her former friends, students who had shared her dormitory and study spaces for 4 years, were actively hoping for her destruction. They weren't content with her social isolation or her family's threats. They wanted to see her completely broken, reduced to the sort of public humiliation that would serve as an object lesson for anyone else who might be tempted to question pure-blood orthodoxy. The realization cut deeper than she had expected, not because she had believed they cared about her personally, but because she had at least assumed they possessed basic human decency. The discovery that they were capable of such casual cruelty toward someone they had once considered an ally revealed something about the nature of Slytherin house loyalty that she had been too naive or too willfully blind to understand before. They didn't value her as a person. They had never valued her as a person. She had been useful to them as long as she reinforced their existing beliefs and maintained their social status. But the moment she began asking uncomfortable questions or demonstrating inconvenient principles, she became expendable. She was nothing more than a replaceable component in a social machine designed to maintain pure-blood supremacy through peer pressure and systematic exclusion of dissenting voices. The thought made her feel sick with something that might have been grief or anger or simple disillusionment with the entire world she had been raised to inhabit. But it also made her feel something else, something that surprised her with its intensity and clarity. It made her feel free. If these people had never really been her friends, if their approval had always been conditional on her willingness to suppress her own moral instincts in favor of their collective prejudices, then losing their regard wasn't really a loss at all. It was simply the recognition of a truth that had always existed beneath the surface of their superficial relationships. She had been performing for an audience that had never deserved the effort, seeking acceptance from people who were fundamentally incapable of accepting anyone who challenged their worldview. The revelation was liberating in ways she hadn't expected, freeing her from obligations and expectations that had never served any purpose beyond maintaining an illusion of belonging that had always been fragile and conditional. She straightened her shoulders and stepped out from behind the tapestry, no longer interested in hiding from conversations about her supposed failures and imminent downfall. If her housemates wanted to discuss her business in public corridors, they could do so in her presence rather than behind her back. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor and drawing startled looks from all 3 boys. "How kind of you to take such a personal interest in my family affairs." Marcus recovered his composure first, his pale face settling into an expression of aristocratic disdain that would have intimidated her just a week earlier. Now it simply looked petty and small, the desperate attempt of someone with no real power to maintain the illusion of superiority through social posturing. "Parkinson," he replied with false courtesy. "We were just discussing the situation that seems to have developed around your recent behavior choices." "Were you?" Pansy smiled with the sort of sharp sweetness that her mother had taught her to use when dealing with social inferiors who had forgotten their place. "How fortunate that you have so much free time to devote to analyzing other people's personal relationships. Though I suppose that's what passes for intellectual activity, when one lacks the courage or curiosity to form one's own opinions about complex subjects." The insult hit its mark with surgical precision, and Pansy could see Marcus's face flush with anger and embarrassment. Adrian and Cassius exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that they had walked into a confrontation that was rapidly moving beyond mere gossip into personal attack territory. "At least we're not throwing ourselves at half-blood celebrities for attention," Marcus snarled, abandoning any pretense of polite discourse. "At least we remember where we come from and what our families expect of us." "Do you?" Pansy's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath the silk that hadn't been there a week earlier. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're so afraid of thinking for yourselves that you'd rather repeat the same tired prejudices your parents fed you as children than risk forming an original thought." She stepped closer to Marcus, close enough that he would have to back down or escalate the confrontation into something that might draw unwanted attention from passing professors. "Tell me, Marcus, when was the last time you questioned anything you'd been taught to believe? When was the last time you looked at the evidence, rather than simply accepting what you wanted to hear?" Marcus's hand moved toward his wand, and for a moment Pansy thought he might actually challenge her to a duel right there in the corridor. Then footsteps echoed from the staircase above them, and all 4 students looked up to see Harry Potter descending toward their impromptu confrontation. He moved with the sort of careful alertness that suggested he had been listening to their conversation for some time, his green eyes taking in the defensive postures and hostile expressions that marked the scene as potentially violent. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of Pansy, close enough to provide support if needed, but not so close as to suggest that she couldn't handle herself. "Problem here?" he asked mildly, his voice carrying the sort of casual authority that came from having faced down significantly more dangerous opponents than 3 teenage bullies with inflated senses of their own importance. Marcus's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like fear, and Pansy realized that for all his bluster about blood purity and family loyalty, he was fundamentally a coward who relied on group intimidation rather than personal courage. Faced with the possibility of a genuine confrontation with someone who had survived encounters with dark wizards and deadly creatures, his resolve was evaporating rapidly. "No problem at all, Potter," Marcus said, with forced lightness, taking a step back that he probably hoped looked casual rather than strategic. "Just having a friendly conversation about academic priorities and social responsibilities." Harry's smile was polite enough to pass casual inspection, but Pansy could see the sharp edges underneath that suggested he was no more fooled by Marcus's explanation than she was. "How nice," he replied with equally false warmth. "I'm always interested in discussions about social responsibility, especially when they involve people standing up for what's right rather than what's convenient." The implication was clear enough, and Marcus's face flushed even darker as he realized that Harry had heard enough of their conversation to understand exactly what sort of friendly discussion had been taking place. Adrian and Cassius were already backing away, clearly unwilling to be associated with whatever unpleasantness was about to unfold. "Come along," Marcus said to his companions with as much dignity as he could muster. "We have better things to do than waste time on lost causes." They left with the sort of hasty retreat that suggested they were more interested in avoiding further embarrassment than in continuing their harassment of Pansy. Within moments, she and Harry were alone in the corridor, the echoes of footsteps fading as her former housemates fled to whatever safe spaces they could find. "Thank you," Pansy said quietly, though the words felt inadequate to express her gratitude for his intervention. "You didn't have to do that." Harry shrugged with the sort of casual heroism that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his approach to moral challenges. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "Friends don't let friends face down bullies alone." The word hit her harder than she had expected, carrying weight and meaning that went far beyond casual social designation. Friends. Harry Potter considered her a friend, someone worthy of protection and support, someone whose well-being mattered to him, regardless of the social costs of that concern. It was the first time in years that someone had offered her friendship based on who she was as a person, rather than what advantages her family connections might provide. "Is that what we are?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on their evolving relationship. "Friends?" Harry studied her face with the sort of careful attention that suggested he was weighing his words with unusual care. "I'd like to think so," he said finally, "unless you have objections to being friends with someone half the school thinks is a dangerous dark wizard." Pansy thought about her parents' letter, about the threats and ultimatums that awaited her on Saturday morning, about the choice she would have to make between her family's expectations and her own moral convictions. "No objections at all," she replied, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised her. "Though you should probably know that my parents are coming to Hogwarts this weekend to discuss my recent behavioral changes. There's a good chance that our friendship is about to become significantly more complicated." Harry's expression grew serious as he processed the implications of what she was telling him. "How complicated?" Pansy considered various ways to explain the gravity of her situation without sounding like she was asking for sympathy or rescue. "The sort of complicated that might involve me being disowned if I don't publicly apologize for defending you and promise never to associate with you again." The silence that followed her admission was heavy with unspoken implications and potential consequences. Harry was clearly processing what it meant that her family was willing to destroy their relationship with their own daughter, rather than allow her to maintain a friendship with someone they considered unsuitable. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and there was genuine remorse in his voice that made Pansy realize he was blaming himself for the situation she found herself in. "I never meant for helping you to cause problems with your family. If you need to distance yourself from me to protect your relationship with them—" "No." The word came out sharper than she had intended, driven by a surge of protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. "Absolutely not. Whatever happens with my family, whatever consequences I have to face, it won't be because I abandoned someone who risked his life to save mine." Harry's expression shifted to something that might have been gratitude or respect, or simple amazement that someone was willing to choose loyalty to him over more practical considerations. Thank you. But I don't want you to sacrifice your family for me. There has to be some middle ground, some way to—" "There isn't." Pansy's voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. "I know my parents, Harry. They don't negotiate when it comes to family reputation and social standing. They'll give me a choice between complete submission or complete rejection, and they'll expect me to choose submission because they can't imagine that anyone would voluntarily give up the security and status that comes with being a Parkinson." She paused, processing the implications of what she was saying, and finding that the prospect of losing her family's support was less terrifying than she had expected it to be. "The problem is that they're wrong about what I value most. They think I'll choose money and social position over principles and genuine friendship. They think I'm too weak or too dependent to survive without their approval and support." "Are they?" Harry asked gently. "Wrong about that, I mean?" Pansy thought about the question seriously, examining her own motivations and fears with the sort of honesty that had become easier since her encounter with the basilisk. Was she strong enough to stand on her own principles, even when it cost her everything she had been raised to consider important? Was she brave enough to choose an uncertain future with people she respected over a secure future with people she was beginning to despise? "I guess we'll find out on Saturday," she said, with a smile that felt more confident than she had expected. "Though I should probably warn you that if they do disown me, I might need help figuring out how to survive as an independent person, rather than a pampered, pure-blood princess." Harry's answering smile was warm enough to drive away some of the chill that had settled in her chest since reading her father's letter. "I think I can probably help with that," he replied. "I've had some experience with surviving difficult family situations." It was the first time he had alluded to his own complicated relationship with his relatives, and Pansy felt a surge of curiosity about what experiences had shaped his understanding of family conflict and personal independence. But before she could ask for details, the sound of approaching footsteps reminded them that they were still standing in a busy corridor where their conversation might be overheard by students or professors who would find their obvious friendship worth commenting on. "We should probably get to class," Harry said reluctantly. "But if you want to talk more about Saturday or anything else, I'll be in the library after dinner. Same table as usual." Pansy nodded, grateful for the implicit invitation to continue their conversation in a more private setting. "I'll see you there," she promised, then watched him walk away toward his defense against the dark arts class, while she made her own way to the dungeons for potions. But as she settled into her usual seat in Snape's classroom, surrounded by housemates who regarded her with increasing hostility and suspicion, she found herself thinking about the look in Harry's eyes when he had called her his friend. Not pity for her situation or calculation about what her support might cost him, but something that looked almost like pride. He was proud to be associated with her, proud that she had found the courage to stand up for her convictions despite the personal cost. It was a reaction she had never encountered from anyone in her family or social circle, where approval was always conditional on maintaining proper appearances and avoiding controversial positions. For the first time in her life, someone valued her not for her family connections or her ability to conform to social expectations, but for her willingness to do what she believed was right, even when it was difficult. The realization followed her through potions class and into the evening, a warm glow of satisfaction that made the hostile stares of her housemates feel less important than they had that morning. She had found something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything to protect and nurture. She had found a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social convenience, and she was beginning to understand that such relationships were rare enough to justify almost any sacrifice necessary to preserve them. The library that evening felt like a sanctuary, its familiar atmosphere of scholarly quiet providing relief from the social tensions that seemed to follow her through every other part of the castle. Harry was already seated at their usual table when she arrived, surrounded by stacks of history books that suggested he had been researching their Chamber of Secrets project with characteristic thoroughness. "Find anything interesting?" she asked as she settled into the chair across from him, grateful for the opportunity to focus on intellectual challenges rather than personal drama. "Actually, yes." Harry's expression was troubled as he gestured toward an open book that appeared to be a collection of medieval wizarding chronicles. "I've been reading about the original chamber incident, trying to understand what really motivated Salazar Slytherin's break with the other founders." Pansy leaned forward with genuine interest, temporarily forgetting her family troubles in favor of the historical mystery that had been occupying her thoughts for days. "What did you find?" "It's complicated," Harry replied, which was becoming his standard response to questions about anything involving Slytherin's legacy. The official histories make it sound like a simple disagreement about admission policies, but the contemporary accounts suggest something much more complex was going on. He turned the book toward her so she could read the relevant passage, his finger pointing to a paragraph written in archaic script that required careful attention to pass accurately. According to this chronicle, Slytherin didn't just oppose admitting Muggle-born students. He believed that the magical world was facing an existential threat from some external force that could only be countered through absolute unity among pure-blood families. Pansy read the passage twice, trying to understand the implications of what the medieval chronicler was describing. External threat? What kind of threat? "That's where it gets really interesting," Harry said, with the sort of excitement that came from discovering unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated facts. The chronicler mentioned something called the convergence, which apparently involved magical interference from somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't part of the normal wizarding world. Pansy felt a chill run down her spine as she processed what Harry was suggesting. "You think Slytherin believed that Muggle-borns were somehow connected to this external threat?" "I think Slytherin believed that the magical world's survival depended on maintaining strict boundaries between different types of people and different types of magic." Harry's voice was thoughtful as he worked through the implications of what they were discovering. "And I think he convinced himself that anyone who didn't share his pure blood heritage might be vulnerable to influence from whatever forces he was worried about." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and both students looked up to see Professor McGonagall walking toward their table with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested official business rather than casual library supervision. "Miss Parkinson," the deputy headmistress said with formal courtesy, "Professor Dumbledore would like to see you in his office. Immediately, if you please." Pansy felt her stomach drop as she realized what this summons probably meant. Her parents had arrived early, or had sent advance communication about their Saturday visit, or had made demands that required immediate administrative attention. Whatever the specific cause, she was being called to account for her behavior in the sort of official setting that suggested serious consequences were being considered. "Of course, Professor," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. She began gathering her books and notes, but Harry's hand closed gently over hers, stopping her automatic movements with a gesture of support and solidarity that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "It'll be all right," he said, quietly, though they both knew he had no way of guaranteeing such a thing. "Whatever happens, you're not facing it alone." Professor McGonagall's expression softened slightly as she observed their obvious friendship, and Pansy wondered what the older woman thought about the unlikely alliance that had developed between a Gryffindor hero and a Slytherin outcast. Did she approve of their growing bond, or did she consider it another complication in an already difficult situation? "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said with careful neutrality, "you're welcome to continue your research here. Miss Parkinson will return when her meeting with the headmaster has concluded." It was a diplomatic way of suggesting that Harry shouldn't worry about her absence, while making it clear that he wouldn't be included in whatever conversation was about to take place in Dumbledore's office. Pansy squeezed his hand once in farewell, then followed Professor McGonagall out of the library and through corridors that seemed more maze-like and threatening than usual. The gargoyle that guarded Dumbledore's office stepped aside at McGonagall's approach, and Pansy found herself climbing the spiral staircase toward whatever fate awaited her at the top. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the deputy headmistress could hear it, but she forced herself to maintain the sort of composed demeanor that her mother had trained her to project during difficult situations. Whatever was waiting for her in Dumbledore's office, she would face it with dignity and honesty. She had chosen her path, and she would stand by the choices that had brought her to this moment, regardless of the consequences they might bring. The office door opened before she could knock, revealing the headmaster's familiar figure silhouetted against the warm light of his private study. Professor Dumbledore looked older than she remembered, his blue eyes shadowed with concerns that went far beyond the academic welfare of individual students. "Miss Parkinson," he said, with gentle courtesy, gesturing for her to enter. "Please come in. We have a great deal to discuss." As she stepped across the threshold into the headmaster's domain, Pansy realized that this conversation would determine not just her immediate future at Hogwarts, but her entire understanding of who she was and who she wanted to become. The choices she made in the next few hours would echo through the rest of her life, shaping her relationships and her identity in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She had crossed the point of no return, and there was no going back to the comfortable certainties of her childhood. All that remained was to move forward with courage and integrity, trusting that the friendships she had found would prove stronger than the expectations she was leaving behind. Behind her, the door closed with quiet finality, sealing her into a conversation that would change everything. Chapter 6. Breaking Points. The meeting in Dumbledore's office had lasted 3 hours and felt like 3 decades, leaving Pansy emotionally drained and oddly exhilarated as she made her way back through the castle's corridors toward the library where she had promised to meet Harry. The conversation with the headmaster had been unlike anything she had expected. Less interrogation than careful exploration, less judgment than gentle guidance through the complex moral territory she was learning to navigate. Dumbledore had known about her parents' impending visit, of course, and about the ultimatum that awaited her on Saturday morning. But rather than offering advice or attempting to influence her decision, he had simply listened as she explained her evolving understanding of loyalty and friendship and moral responsibility. He had asked thoughtful questions that helped her clarify her own thinking, had shared stories about other students who had faced similar choices between family expectations and personal conscience. Most importantly, he had made it clear that whatever decision she made about her family relationships, she would have his support and the protection of Hogwarts School as long as she remained a student. The reassurance had lifted a weight from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying, the constant fear that her defiance of pure-blood orthodoxy might leave her completely alone and unprotected in a world that could be hostile to young witches without family connections. She was no longer facing her crisis in isolation. She had allies now, people who valued her emerging principles more than her family's reputation or social position. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying, forcing her to acknowledge that the person she was becoming bore little resemblance to the person she had been just 2 weeks earlier. The library was nearly empty when she arrived, most students having retired to their common rooms for the evening social rituals that helped maintain house unity and peer relationships. Harry was still seated at their usual table, though the history books had been pushed aside in favor of what appeared to be a defense against the dark arts essay that was giving him considerable trouble. "How did it go?" he asked quietly as she settled into the chair across from him, his green eyes reflecting concern and curiosity in equal measure. Pansy considered various ways to summarize her conversation with Dumbledore, but found that the complexity of what they had discussed resisted simple explanation. "Better than I expected," she said finally. "He wasn't trying to talk me out of defending you or convince me to reconcile with my family. He was just helping me understand what my choices really mean." Harry set down his quill and gave her his full attention, the sort of focused interest that had become one of her favorite things about their friendship. When Harry Potter listened to you, he really listened, as if your words were the most important thing in his universe at that moment. "What do they mean?" he asked seriously. Pansy thought about Dumbledore's gentle questions and patient explanations, about the way he had helped her see that her evolving values weren't a betrayal of her upbringing, but a natural extension of the best parts of what her family had taught her. "They mean that I'm becoming the person I was always supposed to be, rather than the person other people wanted me to be. They mean that I'm finally old enough to choose my own principles instead of just accepting the ones I inherited." She paused, processing the implications of what she was saying, and finding that the prospect of moral independence was less frightening than it had been even that morning. "They mean that whatever happens with my parents tomorrow, I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror without shame." Harry's expression softened with something that might have been pride or affection or simple respect for the journey she was taking. "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "Being able to respect yourself is worth more than most people realize." The comment carried undertones that suggested he was speaking from personal experience, and Pansy found herself wondering what moments of moral crisis had shaped his own understanding of self-respect and personal integrity. But before she could ask for details, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the library entrance. Draco Malfoy was walking toward their table with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested he had been looking for them specifically, his pale face set in an expression of cold determination that made Pansy's stomach clench with anticipation of unpleasantness. Behind him walked a figure that made her blood freeze in her veins, Lucius Malfoy, his aristocratic features radiating the sort of casual authority that came from decades of wielding social and political power over people he considered inferior. "Pansy," Draco said with false courtesy, as he reached their table, his grey eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "How fortunate to find you here. My father wanted to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to his attention." Lucius stepped forward with the fluid grace that characterized pure blood nobility at its most refined and most dangerous, his pale eyes taking in the scene before him with obvious disapproval. The sight of his son's former friend, sitting across from Harry Potter, clearly engaged in intimate conversation, was apparently everything he had been told to expect, and more than he was prepared to tolerate. "Miss Parkinson," he said with icy politeness, his voice carrying the sort of cultured menace that made it clear he was accustomed to having his words carry the weight of command. "How educational to see you pursuing your studies with such diverse companions." The word diverse dripped with contempt, making it clear that Lucius considered Harry's presence at their table to be evidence of the sort of poor judgment that required immediate correction. Pansy felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment, not because she was ashamed of Harry's friendship, but because she recognized the calculated cruelty of Lucius's approach. He wasn't just criticizing her choice of study partners, he was demonstrating his power to humiliate her in front of someone whose opinion she had clearly come to value. It was exactly the sort of psychological manipulation that pure-blood families use to maintain control over their children and social inferiors, the systematic deployment of shame and fear to enforce conformity to established hierarchies. "Mr. Malfoy," she replied with careful neutrality, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the racing of her heart. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you at Hogwarts." Lucius's smile was sharp enough to draw blood, and Pansy realized that he had caught the deliberate hesitation in her response, the way she had turned his own technique back on him with subtle mockery. His pale eyes narrowed with something that might have been amusement or irritation, as if he were recalibrating his assessment of her potential resistance to his influence. "Indeed," he replied smoothly. "I was visiting the school on business matters when young Draco informed me of some troubling developments in your social circles. I felt it was my duty as a family friend to offer some guidance during what must be a confusing time for someone of your age and limited experience with the complexities of wizarding society." Each pause was precisely calculated, designed to convey condescension while maintaining the veneer of polite concern. Lucius Malfoy was a master of social warfare, capable of delivering devastating insults while maintaining plausible deniability about his hostile intentions. But Pansy was no longer the naive 15-year-old who might have been intimidated by such displays of aristocratic authority. Her encounter with the basilisk had taught her what real danger looked like, and her growing friendship with Harry had shown her what genuine courage could accomplish when applied to moral challenges. "How kind of you to take such a personal interest in my education," she said with equal politeness, matching his tone while refusing to back down from the implied challenge. "Though I should point out that my social circles have actually become significantly less confusing recently. It's remarkable how much clearer things become when you start judging people by their character rather than their family connections. The insult hit its mark with surgical precision, and Lucius's mask of polite concern slipped for just a moment to reveal the cold anger beneath. Draco actually flinched at his father's expression, clearly recognizing the signs of genuine rage that most people were wise enough to avoid provoking. "Character?" Lucius repeated softly, and the word carried enough menace to make several nearby students look up from their books in alarm. An interesting concept from someone who seems to have forgotten the most fundamental aspects of loyalty and gratitude that should characterize a young witch of good breeding. He stepped closer to their table, his presence radiating the sort of controlled threat that came from knowing exactly how much damage he could inflict through social and political channels. "Tell me, Miss Parkinson, what do you imagine your parents will say when they learn that their daughter has been spending her evenings in intimate conversation with a half-blood who is widely suspected of being responsible for the attacks on Muggle-born students?" The question was designed to remind her of the consequences that awaited her if she continued to defy pure-blood expectations, to make her confront the reality that her friendship with Harry would cost her everything she had been raised to value. But instead of fear or shame, Pansy felt something that might have been liberation. If Lucius Malfoy considered her friendship with Harry to be scandalous, if the pure-blood establishment found her evolving principles so threatening that they felt compelled to intervene personally, then she must be moving in the right direction. "I imagine," she said with quiet dignity, "that they'll discover their daughter has finally learned to think for herself rather than simply accepting the prejudices she was taught as a child. I imagine they'll realize that the values they raised me to cherish, courage, loyalty, protection of the innocent, are exactly what led me to defend someone who risked his life to save mine." She stood from her chair with deliberate grace, meeting Lucius's pale eyes without flinching despite the growing danger she could see in his expression. "And I imagine they'll have to decide whether they're proud of raising a daughter with principles or disappointed that those principles don't match their political preferences." The silence that followed her words was so complete that Pansy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had not just defied Lucius Malfoy, she had publicly declared her independence from the entire system of pure-blood supremacy that he represented. There would be consequences for such defiance, repercussions that would extend far beyond her immediate family relationships. But for the first time in her life, she found that she didn't care about consequences that were based on other people's inability to accept her moral evolution. "You foolish girl," Lucius said with quiet venom, his mask of civilized behavior finally dropping away to reveal the ugly authoritarianism beneath. "You have no idea what you're throwing away, no concept of what awaits people who forget their place in the natural order of things." "Don't I?" Pansy's voice remained steady despite the fear that was beginning to creep up her spine. "Because from where I'm standing, the natural order seems to involve a lot of cruelty toward people who don't deserve it. It seems to require supporting violence against children whose only crime is being born to the wrong parents." She gestured toward Harry, who had been sitting silently throughout the confrontation, but whose tension was visible in every line of his body. "This person saved my life without expectation of reward or recognition. He risked everything to protect someone who had never shown him anything but contempt. If that's not worthy of loyalty and gratitude, then I'd rather be foolish than wise." Lucius's expression shifted to something approaching genuine hatred, and Pansy realized that she had committed the one unforgivable sin in pure-blood society. She had chosen principle over pragmatism, moral conviction over social advantage. In his worldview, such choices were not just foolish, but actively dangerous, threatening the careful hierarchies that maintained his own power and privilege. "Draco," he said, without taking his eyes off Pansy, "I think it's time for you to make your position clear regarding your former friend's transformation." Some associations become too toxic to maintain, regardless of childhood sentiment. It was a command disguised as a suggestion, giving Draco the opportunity to distance himself from Pansy while maintaining the fiction that he was making an independent decision. But the implication was clear enough. Lucius expected his son to publicly repudiate their friendship as a demonstration of his own loyalty to pure-blood values. Draco looked between his father and Pansy with obvious internal conflict, his pale face showing the strain of choosing between family expectations and whatever remained of his personal affection for someone who had been part of his inner circle for years. For a moment, Pansy thought he might actually defy his father's implicit order, might find the courage to stand by their friendship despite the political costs. Then his expression hardened into the sort of cold, aristocratic disdain that she recognized from their earliest years at Hogwarts, and she knew that whatever bond had once existed between them was about to be severed forever. "You're right, Father," Draco said with quiet conviction. "Some associations do become too toxic to maintain." He looked directly at Pansy, his grey eyes reflecting something that might have been regret or relief or simple resignation. "I can't continue to be friends with someone who has forgotten everything our families taught us about loyalty and proper behavior. Someone who would rather defend our enemies than support her own kind." The words hit Pansy like physical blows, not because she had expected anything different, but because they represented the final destruction of relationships that had once meant everything to her. Draco wasn't just ending their friendship. He was declaring that her moral evolution had made her unworthy of basic respect and human decency. "I understand," she said quietly, and found that she actually did understand. Draco was making the choice that felt safest to him, the choice that would preserve his position within his family and social circle. It wasn't the choice she would have made, but she could recognize the fear and uncertainty that drove it. "Do you?" Lucius's voice carried genuine curiosity, as if he were puzzled by her apparent lack of distress at being abandoned by someone who had been one of her closest friends. "Do you truly understand what isolation awaits you? What it means to be cut off from everyone and everything that has defined your identity since childhood?" Pansy thought about the question seriously, examining her own emotional state with the sort of honesty that had become her default response to moral challenges. Did she understand what she was giving up? Did she appreciate the magnitude of the social and economic consequences that would follow her choice to prioritize principles over pragmatism? "Yes," she said finally. "I understand that I'm giving up relationships that were never based on genuine affection or respect. I understand that I'm losing access to social circles that only valued me as long as I was willing to suppress my own moral instincts. I understand that I'm trading a secure but hollow future for an uncertain but authentic one." She paused, looking directly at Lucius with something that might have been pity for someone so trapped by his own prejudices that he couldn't imagine choosing principles over privilege. "What I don't understand is why you think that's a sacrifice rather than a liberation." The response clearly wasn't what Lucius had expected, and Pansy could see him reassessing her psychological state with growing confusion and irritation. He had anticipated tears and pleas for forgiveness, had expected her to crumble under the weight of social isolation and family disapproval. Instead, she was demonstrating the sort of moral clarity that made his threats feel empty and his authority seem irrelevant. "We shall see," he said finally, his voice carrying the sort of cold promise that suggested consequences were being planned rather than threatened. "We shall see how long your principles sustain you when you're facing the reality of what you've chosen." He turned and walked away with fluid aristocratic grace, Draco following in his wake like a pale shadow. But at the library entrance, Draco looked back once, and Pansy saw something in his expression that might have been genuine regret for the friendship they were both allowing to die. Then they were gone, leaving her alone with Harry in the suddenly oppressive silence of the nearly empty library. She sank back into a chair with legs that felt less steady than they had moments before, the adrenaline of confrontation beginning to ebb and leave her drained in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Are you all right?" Harry asked quietly, his green eyes reflecting concern and something that might have been admiration for the courage she had just displayed. Pansy considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her emotional state with the sort of clinical detachment that helped her process complex feelings without being overwhelmed by them. Was she all right? She had just lost one of her oldest friendships, had been threatened by one of the most powerful men in wizarding society, had chosen a path that would lead to social isolation and family rejection. "I think so," she said with genuine surprise. "Actually, I think I'm better than all right. I think I'm finally becoming someone I can respect." Harry's smile was warm enough to chase away some of the chill that had settled in her chest during the confrontation with Lucius, and she realized that his approval meant more to her than all the pure-blood social connections she was in the process of losing. "You were incredible," he said with quiet conviction. "The way you stood up to him, the way you refused to be intimidated. I've never seen anything like it." The praise hit her harder than she had expected, reminding her that Harry Potter was not someone who gave compliments lightly or for social convenience. If he said she had been brave, then he genuinely believed it, and his opinion carried weight because it was based on his own extensive experience with courage under pressure. "I was terrified," she admitted honestly. "I've never defied someone like Lucius Malfoy before. I wasn't even sure I could do it until the words were coming out of my mouth." "That's what makes it brave," Harry replied. "Doing the right thing even when you're scared, especially when you're scared." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing what had just happened and its implications for their evolving friendship. Pansy felt as if she had crossed some invisible threshold, moved beyond the point where retreat or compromise was possible. She was committed now to whatever consequences her choices might bring, and the knowledge was both liberating and terrifying. "Harry," she said quietly. "Yeah? Thank you for not trying to fight him for me, for letting me handle it myself." She met his eyes with gratitude that went deeper than words could express. "I needed to know I could do it on my own." Harry's expression grew serious as he processed what she was telling him. "I almost did jump in," he admitted. "When he started threatening you, when I saw how scared you were, it took everything I had not to hex him right there in the library." The admission sent a warm flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the realization that Harry Potter cared enough about her well-being to risk confrontation with one of the most dangerous men in wizarding society. He had been willing to fight for her, but he had chosen instead to trust her strength and respect her need for independence. "But you didn't," she said softly. "You trusted me to fight my own battles." "I did," Harry confirmed, "and you proved that my trust was justified." The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications and unspoken possibilities, until it was broken by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor beyond the library. Both students turned toward the disturbance, their conversation forgotten in the face of what sounded like genuine emergency. Professor McGonagall burst through the library entrance with the sort of barely controlled panic that was completely at odds with her usual composed demeanor, her tartan robes billowing behind her as she scanned the room for occupied tables. "Mr. Potter! Miss Parkinson!" she called when she spotted them, her voice tight with stress and something that might have been grief. "I need you both to come with me immediately. There's been another attack." The words hit the library like a physical blow, and Pansy felt her stomach drop as she realized what this meant. Someone else had been found petrified. Another student had fallen victim to the creature that stalked Hogwarts corridors with lethal intent. "Who?" Harry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor McGonagall's expression crumbled for just a moment, revealing the devastation beneath her professional composure. "Miss Granger," she said quietly. Hermione Granger has been found petrified in the library corridor. She's alive, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood what "but" meant in this context. Hermione was alive, but might never recover. Alive, but trapped in a state that was worse than death in some ways. Alive, but beyond the reach of normal, magical healing. Harry's face went completely white, then flushed with an anger so intense that Pansy could practically feel it radiating from him in waves. His best friend, the person who had stood by him through 2 years of adventures and crises, had become the heir's latest victim. "Take me to her," he said, in a voice that carried more authority than she had ever heard from him before. "Now!" As they followed Professor McGonagall out of the library and through corridors that suddenly felt more like a crime scene than a school, Pansy found herself thinking about the conversation she and Harry had been having about research and historical precedents. They had been so focused on understanding the heir's motivations and methods that they had forgotten the most important fact about the situation. The attacks were escalating. The creature was becoming bolder, more aggressive, more willing to strike at targets who should have been protected by their proximity to other students and teachers. And now it had taken Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of their generation, someone whose loss would be felt throughout the entire wizarding world. The thought made Pansy's chest tighten with something that felt like genuine grief, though she had never considered Hermione a friend. But watching Harry's reaction to the news, seeing the devastation in his green eyes, made her understand that this attack was different from the others. This time, the heir had struck at the heart of everything Harry valued most. And from the expression on his face, she knew that he would never forgive such an assault on someone he loved. The corridor where Hermione had been found was crowded with teachers and older students, all speaking in the sort of hushed tones that people used in the presence of tragedy. Pansy caught glimpses of the scene through gaps in the crowd. A motionless figure lying near the library entrance, surrounded by dropped books and scattered parchment that suggested she had been in the middle of research when the attack occurred. "She was found 20 minutes ago," Professor McGonagall explained quietly as they approached the edge of the gathered crowd. "Mr. Longbottom was returning from herbology when he saw her lying there. She's been taken to the hospital wing, but Madame Pomfrey says there's no change from the previous victim's conditions." Harry pushed through the crowd with single-minded determination, ignoring the protests of students who tried to prevent him from reaching the scene. Pansy followed in his wake, using his momentum to carry her past the barriers that would normally have kept unauthorized students away from such a serious incident. She reached the spot where Hermione had been found and immediately understood why Harry had gone so still and quiet. Scattered around the area were books and notes that clearly related to their research into the Chamber of Secrets, histories of Hogwarts, treatises on dangerous magical creatures, even a few handwritten pages that looked like attempts to decode the heir's pattern of victim selection. Hermione had been continuing their investigation on her own, trying to solve the mystery that had consumed so much of their recent attention. And her research had somehow led to her becoming the creature's next target. "She figured it out," Harry said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and devastating grief. "Whatever the answer is, she found it. That's why the heir had to stop her." Pansy knelt beside the scattered papers, trying to piece together Hermione's final thoughts from the fragmentary notes and references that remained. Most of the handwriting was illegible from this distance, but she could make out references to basilisks and mirrors, and something about indirect sight that made her pulse quicken with recognition. "Harry," she whispered urgently, "look at this." She pointed to a piece of parchment that had landed near a decorative mirror mounted on the corridor wall, its surface reflecting the crowd of students and teachers who surrounded the scene. Written in Hermione's precise handwriting were the words "indirect sight, mirrors, water, reflective surfaces," followed by what appeared to be the beginning of a longer explanation that had been cut short by the attack. Harry followed her gaze and immediately understood the significance of what they were seeing. Hermione had been researching the creature's methods, trying to understand how previous victims had managed to survive encounters that should have been instantly fatal.